In a world where scars tell tales of betrayal and survival, a disgraced werewolf ranger with a haunted past meets a hidden king masquerading as a simple farmer. When their worlds collide at Thornwick Gate, a fleeting touch sparks a forbidden mating bond, threatening to unravel secrets that could topple an empire. As raiders, rogues, and royal ultimatums close in, can Briar Nighthelm and Rowan Voss fight for a love that defies destiny? Or will the weight of their crowns and scars tear them apart? Chapter 1. The Scarred Ranger. The morning mist clung to the ancient pines like whispered secrets, and Briar Nighthelm moved through them like a ghost with purpose. Her boots made no sound on the forest floor. 3 years of living rough had taught her that silence meant survival. The silver scars that laced her face caught the filtered sunlight, each one a story she'd rather forget. At 25, she'd already lived 3 lifetimes. The first as the youngest general in the She-Wolf Legion's history. The second as a prisoner of war, earning every scar in dungeons that reeked of silver and despair. The third as a ranger who slept in trees and trusted no one. She paused at the edge of Whisperwood, where the forest met civilization. Below, the village of Millhaven bustled with morning activity, bakers lighting ovens, blacksmiths stoking forges, children chasing chickens through dusty streets. Normal life, the kind she'd once protected, back when she believed protection meant something. Bree Nighthelm. The voice made her hand drift instinctively to the hunting knife at her hip. But it was only Tom Fletcher, the village's message runner, stumbling up the forest path with his usual lack of grace. Easy there, Tom. Her voice carried the kind of authority that made people stand straighter, though she barely raised it above a whisper. What's got you running like the devil's on your heels? Tom bent over, hands on knees, gulping air. Message from the north. Highmere Pack. They're looking for scouts. Briar's emerald eyes sharpened. The Highmere Pack was legendary, the largest territory in the northern reaches, ruled by an alpha whose name was spoken in hushed, reverent tones. She'd heard whispers that their king was more myth than man, that he could shift mid-battle and commanded the loyalty of every wolf from the ice lands to the southern borders. What kind of scouts? She asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. The fighting kind. Tom straightened, finally catching his breath. Border troubles. Raiders hitting supply lines, stealing livestock. They're offering good coin. Gold and grain both. Gold and grain. The kind of payment that could buy her a winter that didn't involve sleeping in trees and hunting rabbits. The kind of payment that could buy her distance from the nightmares that still woke her screaming. Where? Thornwick Gate. That's their southernmost outpost. You'd report to... Tom consulted a crumpled piece of parchment. Someone called the gatekeeper. No name given, just a title. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of rain and something else. Something wild and untamed that made her wolf stir restlessly beneath her skin. Storm coming. Tell them I'll consider it, she said, already turning back toward the forest. Bree, wait! Tom's voice cracked with urgency. There's something else. Word is, whoever they hire, they're expected to stay through harvest season. That's 4 months of steady work. 4 months of steady work. 4 months of not wondering where her next meal would come from. 4 months of purpose, even if that purpose was just another war. She touched the deepest scar, the one that ran from her left temple to her jaw, a parting gift from her last commanding officer. The man who'd sold out her entire legion for 30 pieces of silver and a promise of safe passage. I'll think about it, she said again, and melted back into the forest before Tom could say another word. But as she climbed to her usual sleeping tree, a massive oak with branches thick enough to support a bedroll and high enough to see trouble coming, she knew she'd already made her decision. The alternative was another winter alone with her ghosts, and she wasn't sure she could survive that. The rain began as the sun set, fat droplets that drummed against the leaves above her makeshift shelter. Tomorrow she'd head north to Thornwick Gate. Tomorrow she'd meet this mysterious gatekeeper and see if the Highmere Pack could offer her what she needed most. Not redemption. She was past believing in that fairy tale. But maybe if she was lucky, they could offer her a reason to keep fighting that didn't involve revenge. Lightning split the sky, illuminating her scars in stark relief. In the distance, a wolf howled, lonely and wild and full of longing. Despite herself, Briar found herself howling back. Chapter 2. The cowhide farmer dawn broke gray and cold over the goat pastures of Thornwick Gate, and Rowan Voss was already 3 hours into his morning chores. The animals didn't care that he was technically the most powerful alpha in the known world. They cared that their water was fresh, their hay was clean, and their pregnant doe got the extra grain she needed. He ran a calloused hand through his dark hair, pushing it back from eyes that most people would recognize as pure gold if they bothered to look. But nobody looked at farmers. Not really. They saw the worn leather vest, the patched boots, the careful way he kept his head down and his voice soft, and they dismissed him as another hired hand, which was exactly the point. At 29, Rowan had been king of the Highmere Pack for 7 years, and he was tired of crowns. Tired of councils that spoke in platitudes and conspiracies. Tired of nobles who saw his throne as a prize to be won through the right marriage alliance. Most of all, he was tired of being alone in rooms full of people who claimed to serve him, but had never bothered to know him. 3 years ago, he'd made a decision that scandalized his entire court. He'd walked away. Not permanently. He still handled the pack's major decisions, still protected their borders, still carried the ultimate responsibility for 60,000 wolves. But he'd moved to this remote outpost, taken the title of gatekeeper, and lived like what he'd always wanted to be. Just a man with simple problems and simpler solutions. The arrangement had worked beautifully until 2 months ago, when his meddling council had issued an ultimatum: return to court and choose a bride by harvest time, or they'd choose one for him. The threat wasn't idle. Pack law was clear about unmated alphas past 30, and his birthday was just 6 months away. He was contemplating the injustice of it all when the billy goat, Horatio, decided to make his morning more interesting by headbutting the gate latch. The gate swung open, and 23 goats immediately made a break for freedom. "Damn it, Horatio," Rowan muttered, vaulting the fence with inhuman grace. "We've talked about this." It took him the better part of an hour to round them up, and by the time he'd reinforced the latch with new rope, the sun was high enough to cast proper shadows. That's when he caught the scent. Female, wolf, unknown, and carrying the metallic tang of old violence. Not fresh blood, but the kind of scars that Silver left behind. His wolf stirred with interest, pushing against his human consciousness with enough force to make his eyes flash gold. "Down," he commanded silently. The last thing he needed was his wolf deciding to get territorial over a complete stranger. But when she emerged from the tree line, silhouetted against the morning sky like some goddess of war, his wolf went completely silent, as if even his beast understood that this was a moment that demanded reverence. She was tall for a woman, with the kind of lean muscle that came from hard living and harder fighting. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid, and she moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd learned that hesitation could mean death. But it was her face that made his breath catch. Not just because she was beautiful, though she was, in the way that ancient statues were beautiful. It was the scars, silver scars, pale and raised, that mapped a constellation of pain across her left cheek and temple. Someone had hurt her. Someone had hurt her badly, with silver specifically designed to leave permanent marks on shifters. His wolf snarled, a sound that almost escaped his throat before he clamped down on it. She approached the gate with the confident stride of someone who'd never learned to be afraid, and when she spoke, her voice carried the kind of authority that made his spine straighten despite himself. "I'm looking for the gatekeeper. I'm told he's hiring scouts." "That would be me," he said, amazed that his voice came out steady. "Rowan Voss, and you are?" "Briar Nighthelm." She studied him with green eyes that seemed to see too much. "I'm told you need fighters." The name hit him like a physical blow. Briar Nighthelm, the ghost of Silverstone Pass, the woman who'd held the border against impossible odds until her own people betrayed her. Every wolf in the Northern Territories knew that story, though most believed it was legend. Looking at her now, at the scars that corroborated every whispered tale of silver chains and torture, he realized that legends sometimes walked among mortals. "I might," he said carefully. "Depends on what you're fighting for." It was the wrong thing to say. Her expression closed off like a door slamming shut, and her hand drifted to the knife at her hip. "I fight for coin," she said flatly. "Nothing more, nothing less. If that's not good enough for you, I can be gone before the sun moves another inch." "Easy." He raised his hands in a gesture of peace, noting the way she tracked the movement like she expected an attack. "I meant no offense. It's just, around here, we like to know our people won't run when things get difficult." "I don't run." The simple statement carried so much steel that he found himself believing it without question. This was a woman who would die before she retreated, who would hold the line even if it killed her, which, judging by her scars, it nearly had. "Prove it," he said, the words out of his mouth before his brain could catch up. Her eyebrows rose. "Excuse me? You heard me." He gestured toward the practice yard beside the gate. Nothing fancy, just packed dirt surrounded by a wooden fence. "One honest reason to fight for us." "Show me." For a moment he thought she'd walk away. Her jaw tightened, and something flickered in her eyes that might have been hurt. But then her lips curved in what might charitably be called a smile. "Your funeral," she said, and vaulted the gate without touching it. The casual display of athleticism shouldn't have impressed him. He was an alpha after all, and superhuman physicality was part of the package. But there was something about the way she moved, fluid and predatory, and utterly confident, that made his wolf sit up and take notice all over again. She landed in the practice yard and immediately swept up a wooden practice staff, testing its weight with a few experimental swings. "Rules?" "First one on their back loses," he said, grabbing a staff of his own. "Works for me." She attacked without warning, the staff whistling through the air toward his head in a strike that would have killed him if he'd been human. He got his own weapon up just in time, the impact jarring his arms and making his teeth rattle. She didn't give him time to recover. The follow-up came low and fast, aimed at his knees, and he had to dance backward to avoid it. Then she reversed direction, spinning the staff in a complex pattern that turned it into a blur of motion. He'd been trained by the finest weapons masters in the kingdom. He'd led armies and fought duels with legendary warriors. But this woman, this scarred, fierce, magnificent woman, was making him work for every breath. She was fast, not supernaturally fast. He could tell she was staying human for the fight, but fast in the way that only came from years of life and death combat. Every movement was economical, purposeful, designed to end the fight as quickly as possible. But he had advantages she didn't know about. Size, for one, he was nearly a foot taller and outweighed her by at least 60 pounds. Strength, for another, even in human form, his alpha genetics gave him an edge. An experience of a different kind, not just fighting for his life, but fighting for the lives of everyone who looked to him for protection. The deciding moment came when she overextended on a particularly aggressive thrust. He sidestepped, grabbed the staff, and used her own momentum to send her stumbling forward. Then he swept her legs with his own staff and watched her hit the ground hard enough to knock the wind from her lungs. But even as she fell, she was moving. Her leg hooked behind his ankle, and suddenly he was the one falling, landing on his back in the dirt with enough force to see stars. For a heartbeat, they lay there breathing hard, staff weapons forgotten. Then she rolled to her feet and offered him a hand up. "Draw," she suggested. He took her hand, and the moment their skin touched, the world exploded. It started as warmth, just the simple heat of human contact. But then it spread, racing up his arm and straight to his heart, where it settled with the weight of destiny. His wolf roared to life, not with aggression, but with recognition so profound it made him gasp. "Mate." The thought hit him with the force of revelation, and judging by the way her eyes went wide, she felt it too. A golden thread seemed to shimmer in the air between them, visible for just a moment before it faded. She jerked her hand back like she'd been burned, stumbling away from him with something that might have been panic in her eyes. She started, then stopped, pressing her hand to her chest like she was trying to contain something. "Battle high," he said quickly, scrambling to his feet. "Happens sometimes after a good fight. Adrenaline can play tricks." It was a lie, and they both knew it, but she seized on it like a lifeline, nodding too quickly. "Right. Battle high. That's, that's all it was. The silence stretched between them, heavy with things neither of them was ready to acknowledge. Finally, she cleared her throat. So, do I get the job? You get the job, he said, meaning it. Even if she turned out to be the most dangerous thing that had ever walked into his life, and he was increasingly sure she was, he couldn't let her walk away. Not now. Not when his wolf had finally found what it had been searching for. Good. She adjusted her pack, all business again. Where do I bunk? He gestured toward a low building near the main gate. Ranger barracks. Third door on the left. Meals are at dawn, noon, and dusk in the common hall. Pay is monthly, half in coin, half in supplies. She nodded and started toward the barracks, then paused. Voss, she said without turning around, that was a good fight. So was that, Nighthelm. She walked away without another word, but he caught her looking back once, her green eyes unreadable in the growing shadows of evening. Then she disappeared into the barracks, leaving him alone with his racing heart in the scent of wildflowers and steel that seemed to have permanently imprinted itself on his memory. His wolf was practically vibrating with satisfaction, and for the first time in years, Rowan found himself smiling. Really smiling, as he went back to check on the goats. Horatio looked at him with what might have been judgment in his yellow eyes. Don't start, Rowan muttered. It's complicated. The billy goat snorted, as if to say that everything was complicated when humans were involved. Rowan couldn't argue with that logic. Chapter 3, Gate Crash Meeting. The Ranger Barracks turned out to be a long, low building that had seen better decades. The wooden floors creaked with every step. The windows were more gap than glass. And Briar's assigned bunk looked like it had been assembled by someone who'd heard about furniture, but never actually seen any. But it had a roof, 4 walls, and a door that locked. After 3 years of sleeping in trees, it felt like luxury. She dropped her pack on the narrow cot and began her evening routine, checking exits, noting sight lines, cataloging potential weapons. Old habits from her army days, but habits that had kept her alive when everything else failed. The common hall Voss had mentioned was exactly what she expected. Rough wooden tables, a massive fireplace that probably hadn't been cleaned since the building was constructed, and food that was filling, if not particularly inspired. The other Rangers were a mixed bunch, mostly male, mostly young, all carrying the kind of scars that came from serious fighting. They watched her with the wary curiosity of men who'd heard stories, but weren't sure which ones to believe. She ignored them, ate her stew in silence, and retreated to the barracks before anyone could work up the courage to approach her. But sleep, when it finally came, brought dreams of golden eyes and calloused hands, of a touch that had felt like coming home after years of wandering. She woke before dawn with her heart racing and the phantom sensation of fingers entwined with hers. Damn it, she muttered into her pillow. This was exactly the kind of complication she didn't need. The next 3 days fell into a pattern. Dawn patrol along the southern border, checking for signs of the raiders who'd been harassing supply convoys. Midday training with the other Rangers, most of whom were decent enough fighters but lacked the killer instinct that real combat required. Evening reports to Voss, who listened to her recommendations with the kind of attention that suggested he actually valued her expertise. It should have been routine, comfortable even, but every interaction with him left her feeling slightly off balance, as if the ground beneath her feet wasn't quite solid. He was good at the gatekeeper role. She had to give him that. He knew every Ranger by name, could discuss supply logistics with the quartermaster and grain futures with the local farmers, and handled disputes with the kind of quiet authority that made people want to follow him. But there were moments, quick flashes when he thought no one was looking, where she caught glimpses of something deeper. Something that suggested Rowan Voss was much more than a simple border guard. The way he moved, for one thing, he had the fluid grace of someone trained in combat from childhood, not just someone who'd picked up a sword for practical reasons. The way he spoke, for another, his accent was educated, refined, the kind that came from noble tutors and court schooling. And his eyes held the weight of someone who'd made decisions that affected thousands of lives. She was pondering this mystery on the 4th evening when the storm hit. It came out of nowhere. One moment she was walking back from patrol under clear skies. The next she was fighting through horizontal rain, driven by winds that bent trees nearly to the ground. Lightning split the sky every few seconds, followed by thunder that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. The wagons were overturned, their contents scattered across the rocky ground. Supplies that should have fed the outpost for a week were trampled into the dirt or burning in small sullen fires. But it was the smell that hit her first, blood and fear and the metallic tang of silver weapons. She made it to the barracks just as the roof began to leak. Then the leaking became a deluge. Then a section of the ceiling collapsed entirely, taking out half the bunks including hers. "Well," said Marcus, one of the younger rangers, staring at the wreckage with philosophical resignation, "that's unfortunate." Unfortunate was one word for it. Briar could think of several others, most of them involving creative profanity. "Anyone know where we're supposed to sleep now?" asked Elena, the only other female ranger, wringing water out of her hair. "Common hall's got a fireplace," Marcus suggested. "Floor's not too soft if you've got extra blankets." They were still debating sleeping arrangements when Voss appeared in the doorway, soaked to the skin and looking like he'd run the entire way from wherever he'd been when the storm hit. "Everyone all right?" His eyes swept the group, lingering for just a moment longer on Briar than strictly necessary. "Any injuries?" "Just our dignity and our dry clothes," Elena said wryly. "Building's not exactly weatherproof anymore." Voss surveyed the damage. Ceiling beams hanging at dangerous angles, water pooling on the floor, personal belongings scattered like debris from a shipwreck. His jaw tightened. "Right. Marcus, Elena, you can bunk in the guardhouse tonight. There are spare cots in the armory. Jensen and Tomlin, the grain storage barn, has a loft that should be dry. Nighthelm." He paused, running a hand through his wet hair. Lightning flickered outside, casting stark shadows across his face. "There's space in the stable loft," he said finally. "It's warm, dry, and the hay makes decent bedding. I can set up a cot up there for you." The stable loft, where he probably spent most of his nights, judging by the way he talked about it. The idea of sleeping in the same building as him made her wolf stir with interest, which was exactly why she should refuse. "The common hall floor will be fine," she said. "No, it won't." His voice carried a note of authority that made everyone in the group straighten unconsciously. "That fireplace smokes, the floor's stone, and you'll spend the night shivering instead of sleeping. You've got patrol again at dawn. You need actual rest." He was right, damn him. And the alternative was admitting that she was afraid to be alone with him, which would raise questions she had no intention of answering. "Fine," she said. "Stable loft. But I don't need you to set up anything for me. I can manage." Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or disappointment. But he just nodded. "Suit yourself. There's clean hay in the third stall and blankets in the tack room. Help yourself to whatever you need." He was gone before she could respond, melting into the storm like he'd never been there at all, which left her standing in a collapsed building, wondering why his offer of help had felt so much like something else entirely. An hour later, she was perched in the stable loft with a fairly comfortable nest made of hay and horse blankets, listening to the storm rage outside. The space was larger than she'd expected, big enough for several people, with windows that looked out over the pastures and a ladder that led down to the main stable area. It was also, she realized, completely separate from the rest of the compound. Private, intimate even in a way that made her nervous. She was just settling down to sleep when she heard voices below. Soft murmurs that might have been conversation, followed by a sound that made her freeze. Singing. Someone was singing a lullaby in a voice so gentle and warm it made her chest ache. "Easy, sweetheart," the voice murmured. "I know it hurts, but you're doing fine. Just breathe through it. That's my girl." Curious despite herself, she crept to the edge of the loft and peered down. In the largest stall, Voss was kneeling beside a heavily pregnant goat, the doe she'd seen him giving extra grain to. His big hands were gentle on the animal's side, and he was singing softly in a language she didn't recognize. The doe was in labor, she realized, and he was staying with her, keeping her calm, making sure she didn't go through it alone. Something cracked open in her chest, a feeling so foreign and overwhelming, she didn't have words for it. When was the last time someone had shown her that kind of tenderness? When was the last time anyone had cared enough to sit with her in her darkest moments? She watched him work, checking the doe's progress, adjusting her position, never once losing patience or gentleness, even when the animal grew restless and difficult. When the first kid finally arrived, slick and tiny and perfect, his face lit up with such pure joy that she felt tears prick her eyes. "There you go, Rosie," he murmured, helping the newborn find its footing. "Look what you made. Isn't she beautiful?" Briar retreated to her makeshift bed, but sleep was impossible. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw his face in the lamplight, saw the reverent way he'd touched the newborn goat, heard the love in his voice as he sang lullabies to ease a mother's pain. This was dangerous, this feeling in her chest, this warmth spreading through her veins. It was dangerous in ways that silver chains and torture chambers had never been. Those had only threatened her body. This threatened something much more essential. But as she finally drifted off to sleep, lulled by the sound of his voice still singing softly below, she found she couldn't bring herself to care about the danger. For the first time in 3 years, she felt safe. Chapter 4. One Roof, One Bed. Briar woke to the sound of contented bleating and the smell of fresh hay. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then the events of the previous night came flooding back. The storm, the collapsed barracks, the stable loft, Rowan Voss singing lullabies to a goat in labor. She sat up, running her hands through her tangled hair, and peered over the edge of the loft. The stable below was quiet except for the soft sounds of animals settling into their morning routine. No sign of Voss, though she could hear movement from the direction of the goat pen. By the time she'd climbed down the ladder and made herself presentable, he was emerging from the largest stall with a bucket of soiled hay and a satisfied expression. "Morning," he said, his voice carefully neutral. "Sleep well?" "Well enough." She gestured toward the stall. "How's the new mother?" His face brightened immediately, and she felt that dangerous warmth in her chest again. "She's perfect. Both of them are." "Want to see?" Before she could think of a reason to refuse, he was leading her to the stall where the doe, Rosie he'd called her, was nursing a tiny kid with unsteady legs and enormous brown eyes. "She's beautiful," Briar heard herself say, and meant it. There was something about new life that always caught her off guard, reminded her that the world wasn't entirely dark and brutal. "First birth is always the hardest," Voss said quietly, "but Rosie's a fighter. Like someone else I know." The comment was casual enough, but something in his tone made her look at him sharply. He was watching her with those golden eyes, and for a moment the air between them felt charged with possibility. Then the moment shattered as Marcus came jogging up to the stable, slightly out of breath and clearly agitated. "Rowan, we've got a problem," he called. "The supply convoy from Millhaven, they're 3 hours overdue." Voss was immediately all business, the gentle farmer disappearing behind the mask of command authority. "How many wagons?" "4, plus 8 guards. They should have been here before dawn." "Raiders?" "That's what we're thinking. Elena's already scouting the main road. But if they hit the convoy at Deadman's Curve..." Marcus shook his head grimly. Briar knew Deadman's Curve, a narrow pass through rocky hills that was perfect for ambushes. If raiders had hit the convoy there, the guards would have had nowhere to run and limited options for defense. "I'll take a team and backtrack the route," Voss said. "Marcus, you're with me. Get Jensen and Tomlin armed and mounted." "I'll come too," Briar said. Voss turned to her, and she saw him struggle with something, probably the urge to tell her to stay behind where it was safe. But he was smart enough to know that would be both insulting and stupid. "Can you ride?" he asked instead. "Well enough." 20 minutes later, they were mounted and heading south at a pace that would have been reckless if they'd been ordinary humans. But shifters healed fast and had reflexes that made dangerous riding merely inadvisable rather than suicidal. They found the convoy at Deadman's Curve, just as Marcus had predicted. The wagons were overturned, their contents scattered across the rocky ground. Supplies that should have fed the outpost for a week were trampled into the dirt or burning in small, sullen fires. But it was the smell that hit her first, blood and fear and the metallic tang of silver weapons. "Spread out," Voss ordered quietly. "Check for survivors, but watch for traps. Raiders like to leave surprises." Briar dismounted and began working her way through the wreckage, all her senses on high alert. The attack had been recent, within the last 2 hours judging by the scent trails. Professional work too. These weren't desperate bandits looking for easy coin. They were soldiers, well-armed and disciplined. She found the first body behind an overturned wagon, one of the guards dead from a silver blade through the heart. The second was nearby, throat torn out by claws. Human form attack followed by shifted combat, coordinated and brutal. "Here!" Marcus called from the far side of the pass. "I've got 2 alive." They were guards, both badly wounded but conscious. The first was a middle-aged man with a gash across his forehead that would need stitches. The second was barely more than a boy, clutching a broken arm and trying not to cry. "How many attackers?" Voss asked gently, kneeling beside the older guard. "Dozen, maybe more." The man's voice was shaky but determined. "They knew exactly where to hit us. Knew our route, our timing, everything. This wasn't random." Voss and Briar exchanged glances. An inside job, then. Someone was feeding information to the raiders. "What did they take?" she asked. "Everything they could carry, food, weapons, medicine. But they were looking for something specific. Kept asking about the package." "What package?" "Sealed crate from the capital. Official courier seal. We were told to deliver it straight to the gatekeeper. No questions asked." Voss's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Did they find it?" "Don't think so. It was in the lead wagon, hidden under grain sacks. When the attack started, young Tom here grabbed it and ran for the rocks. Probably still up there somewhere. They found the crate 20 minutes later, wedged behind a boulder where the young guard had stashed it before doubling back to help his comrades. It was about the size of a weapon case, made of reinforced wood and bound with iron straps. The royal seal was still intact. "Official business," Voss said, but something in his voice suggested he knew exactly what was inside. They loaded the wounded onto spare horses and began the ride back to Thornwick Gate, but Briar's mind was racing. Raiders with inside information, attacking a convoy carrying official packages for the gatekeeper. It felt like the opening move in a larger game, one that could get all of them killed if they weren't careful. "You're thinking too loud," Voss said, pulling his horse alongside hers. "Just wondering what's in the box that's worth killing for. Could be anything, military dispatches, supply requisitions, court gossip." "Could be," she agreed, "but you don't think it is." He was quiet for a long moment, studying the horizon with the kind of focus that suggested he was seeing more than just landscape. "No," he said finally, "I don't think it is." Back at the compound, they got the wounded guards settled in the infirmary and began the process of reporting the attack to higher authorities. But it was the sealed crate that dominated Briar's attention. Voss had taken it straight to his quarters, a small building behind the stable that she'd never paid much attention to before. Evening came with no sign of him emerging, and curiosity finally got the better of her. She knocked on his door just after sunset, using the excuse of delivering her patrol report. He opened the door looking haggard, as if he'd aged years in the space of a single afternoon. Behind him, she could see the crate sitting open on a rough wooden table, its contents scattered across the surface. "Everything all right?" she asked. For a moment, he looked like he was going to lie. Then his shoulders sagged slightly and he stepped aside to let her in. "Court summons," he said simply. "The Pack Council wants me back in the capital." Immediately, she looked at the papers on the table, official documents with royal seals, written in the formal language of Pack law and political necessity. But one phrase jumped out at her: failure to comply with mating requirements. "They're calling in your marriage ultimatum," she said, understanding flooding through her. "Apparently my time's up." He moved to the table, gathering the papers with hands that weren't quite steady. "The harvest ball is in 2 weeks. I'm expected to choose a bride from the available candidates, or they'll choose one for me. And if you refuse, exile, loss of title, dissolution of bloodline rights." His laugh was bitter. "They've been very thorough in their legal research." Briar felt something twist in her chest, a feeling she didn't want to examine too closely. "So you'll go." "I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something raw and desperate in his golden eyes. Is there? Because I've been trying to find one for 3 years, and I keep coming back to the same impossible conclusion, which is that I'd rather be alone forever than bound to someone who doesn't know me. Someone who wants the crown but not the man wearing it. He moved closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I want what my parents had, what every wolf dreams of, a mate who chose me for myself, not for what I could give them. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning, and despite every instinct screaming at her to run, to put distance between them before she did something stupid, she found herself stepping closer instead. Maybe, she said quietly, you're looking in the wrong places. His breath caught. Briar, don't. She held up a hand, though whether to stop him or stop herself, she wasn't sure. Don't say whatever you're thinking of saying, because we both know this. Whatever this is, it's impossible. Why? The simple question broke something inside her. Because I'm nobody, a disgraced soldier with more scars than sense. Because you're... She gestured helplessly at the papers, the royal seals, the weight of responsibility that seemed to follow him everywhere. Because you're you. And what if I don't want to be me? The words came out raw, desperate. What if I want to be just Rowan, the man who tends goats and fixes gates and falls asleep to the sound of someone else's breathing? She couldn't handle the naked longing in his voice, couldn't handle the way he was looking at her, like she might be the answer to prayers she was afraid to voice. The storm damage to the barracks, she said abruptly. How long before it's repaired? He blinked at the change of subject. A week, maybe 2. Why? Because I can't keep sleeping in your loft. Why not? Because every night I lie awake listening to you breathe. Because this morning I wanted to climb down that ladder and curl up next to you in the hay. Because you're breaking down every wall I've spent 3 years building, and I don't know how to stop you. Because it's not appropriate, she said instead. Since when do you care about appropriate? Since you started looking at me like I matter, she thought but didn't say. Instead, she turned toward the door. I'll find somewhere else to sleep. The common hall, maybe, or... His hand closed around her wrist, gentle but insistent. Stay. The single word hung between them, loaded with implications neither of them was ready to face. Rowan! Not in the loft, he said quickly. There's a spare room in the main house. It's small, but it's private, and it doesn't leak when it rains. She should say no, should walk away before this got any more complicated than it already was. But the alternative was sleeping on the common hall floor for 2 weeks, and her back was already protesting from too many nights on hard surfaces. Fine, she said, but I pay rent. Like hell. I'm not a charity case. I never said you were. His thumb brushed across her wrist, and she felt the dangerous warmth spreading up her arm again. I said stay, because I sleep better knowing you're close enough to hear if something goes wrong. Nothing's going to go wrong. Famous last words. Despite herself, she found her lips quirking upward. You're assuming I'd come running if you called for help. Wouldn't you? The question caught her off guard with its quiet certainty. Would she? If she heard sounds of struggle from his room, would she grab a weapon and come running? Or would she assume he could handle whatever trouble found him? She already knew the answer, which was exactly the problem. 1 week, she said, until the barracks are repaired. 1 week, he agreed. But they both knew it was a lie. 1 week would become 2, would become a month, would become whatever excuse they could find to keep orbiting each other like binary stars. Too close for safety, too far apart for satisfaction. The spare room turned out to be exactly what he'd promised. Small, clean, and private. It held a narrow bed, a chest of drawers, and a window that looked out over the goat pastures. Simple and functional, like everything else about this place, like everything else about him. She was unpacking her few possessions when she heard voices from the main room. Voss talking to someone in low, urgent tones. The conversation was too quiet to make out individual words, but the tone was unmistakably serious. A few minutes later, there was a soft knock on her door. Come in. Voss entered, carrying 2 steaming mugs that smelled like mulled cider and something stronger. He looked exhausted, worn down by the weight of decisions he wasn't ready to make. "Thought you might want something warm," he said, offering her one of the mugs. "It's going to be a cold night." She accepted the drink gratefully, wrapping her hands around the warm ceramic. More bad news. Elena's back from patrol. The raiders hit another convoy this afternoon. Larger one, heading for the Northern Territories. Same pattern as this morning's attack. Inside information again? Has to be. They knew exactly which route to hit, exactly when the convoy would be most vulnerable. He sank into the room's only chair, suddenly looking older than his years. Someone in the pack hierarchy is feeding them information, someone with access to shipping schedules and guard rotations. Briar felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Any ideas who? Too many ideas. Not enough proof. He took a long drink from his mug, staring out the small window at the darkening sky. The timing's not coincidental. These attacks started right after the court issued my marriage ultimatum. Someone wants me distracted, wants me to look weak and unprepared when I show up for the harvest ball. Someone who benefits if you're forced into an unwanted marriage, or someone who benefits if I refuse and get exiled. His smile was grim. Politics makes strange bedfellows, as they say. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, nursing their drinks and listening to the wind pick up outside. Finally, Briar spoke. "For what it's worth, I think you're right to resist." He looked at her sharply. "Even if it means giving up everything I've worked for? Especially then. A crown isn't worth much if you have to sell your soul to keep it." Spoken like someone who's never had to choose between personal happiness and the welfare of 60,000 people. The comment stung, but she could hear the pain behind it. "You're right. I've never had that kind of responsibility, but I've had to choose between doing what was right and doing what was safe. And I learned that you can live with losing everything except your integrity." "Is that what happened to your legion?" The question was quiet, carefully neutral, but it hit her like a physical blow. She'd wondered when he would ask, when his curiosity about her past would overcome his natural discretion. "Someone made a deal," she said finally. 30 pieces of silver and safe passage in exchange for intelligence about our position, our numbers, our supply lines. When the attack came, we were surrounded, outnumbered, and betrayed by the people we trusted most. "And you survived." "I survived." The words tasted like ash. "Lucky me." "That's not luck, Briar. That's strength." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Understanding, recognition. The look of someone who'd been betrayed by people he'd trusted, who'd learned that loyalty was a luxury most people couldn't afford. "You know what it's like," she said, not quite a question. "I know what it's like to discover that power makes everyone around you either a threat or a target. I know what it's like to lie awake wondering which of your advisors is the one selling information to your enemies. I know what it's like to realize that everyone who claims to serve you has their own agenda." He leaned forward, his golden eyes intense. "But I also know what it's like to meet someone who looks at you and sees the person, not the position." The air between them felt charged again, heavy with possibility and danger. She should say something, should break the tension before it pulled them both under. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, she found herself studying his face. The strong jawline, the laugh lines around his eyes, the way his hair fell across his forehead when he wasn't being careful about his appearance. He was beautiful in the way that wild things were beautiful, all leashed power and barely contained strength. "This is a bad idea," she said quietly. "Probably. It'll end badly. Most good things do. We barely know each other. I know you sing to yourself when you think no one's listening. I know you check the locks twice before you go to sleep. I know you have nightmares about silver chains, and you wake up fighting shadows." His voice was soft, intimate. "I know you'd die before you'd run from a fight, and you'd kill anyone who threatened something you cared about. What else do I need to know?" "Everything," she thought. "The way I earn these scars, the names of the people I've killed, the reason I can't shift anymore without feeling like I'm suffocating, the fact that I'm broken in ways that don't heal." But looking at him, at the way he was watching her, like she was something precious and rare, She found herself wanting to believe that maybe broken things could still be beautiful. Maybe damaged goods could still find someone who saw value in the wreckage. "Rowan," she whispered, and his name on her lips sounded like a prayer. He stood slowly, setting his mug aside, and moved toward her with the careful grace of someone approaching a wild animal. When he reached the bed where she was sitting, he stopped, leaving just enough space between them for her to retreat if she wanted to. "Tell me to go," he said quietly. "Tell me this is crazy and inappropriate and doomed to failure, and I'll walk out that door right now." She looked up at him, at the vulnerability in his golden eyes, at the way his hands were clenched at his sides like he was fighting not to reach for her. She should tell him to go, should protect them both from the inevitable heartbreak that would come when his real life caught up with this fantasy. Should remember that she was nobody special, just a broken soldier with trust issues and a talent for violence. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, her scarred fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw. "Stay," she whispered. Chapter 5, The Midnight Hunt. He stayed, not in the way her body was suddenly, desperately hoping for, but in the way that mattered more, sinking into the chair beside her bed, close enough to touch but careful not to presume. They talked until the candles burned low, about nothing and everything, her childhood in the mountain territories, his memories of learning to shift under his father's patient guidance, the books they'd read, the places they'd traveled, the dreams they'd harbored before life taught them that dreams were dangerous luxuries. When exhaustion finally claimed her, she fell asleep to the sound of his breathing, steady and reassuring in the darkness. And for the first time in 3 years, the nightmares stayed away. She woke to chaos, shouting from the direction of the main gate, the sharp crack of crossbow bolts, the unmistakable sound of something large and angry crashing through the outer fence. Briar was out of bed and reaching for her weapons before she was fully awake, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought would have been too slow. Beside her, Rowan was doing the same, though she noticed he grabbed a sword that looked far too fine for a simple gatekeeper. "Raiders?" she asked, checking her knife belt. "Worse. Listen." She paused, focusing her enhanced hearing past the sounds of human chaos to what lay beneath. There, the distinctive howling of wolves, but not pack wolves, calling for aid or coordination. These were the savage, hungry cries of rogues. "How many?" "6, maybe 8. They've got the goat pen surrounded." Briar's blood ran cold. Rogues were bad enough under normal circumstances, shifters who'd lost their human minds to the wolf, becoming something that was neither beast nor man, but a nightmare fusion of both. But rogues attacking in coordinated packs were something else entirely. They were smart, organized, and utterly without mercy. They burst through the door to find the compound in controlled chaos. The other rangers were already armed and moving, following emergency protocols that spoke of experience with this kind of attack. But it was the scene at the goat pen that made Briar's heart clench. The rogues had somehow gotten through the inner fence. 8 massive wolves with glowing red eyes and foam-flecked muzzles, circling the terrified animals like death made manifest. They were bigger than natural wolves, twisted by whatever had broken their minds into something that belonged in nightmares. And they were hunting. "Silver nets," Marcus called out, tossing Rowan a weighted net that gleamed with metallic thread. "Elena's got the crossbow. Everyone else, standard formation." Standard formation meant surrounding the rogues, cutting off their escape routes, and taking them down with minimal risk to the compound's inhabitants. It was textbook pack tactics, efficient and proven. It was also completely wrong for this situation. "No," Briar said sharply, studying the rogues' positioning. "Look at how they're moving. This isn't random. They're herding the goats toward the far corner, concentrating them." "So?" Jensen, the youngest ranger, looked confused. "So rogues don't think tactically. They attack whatever's closest, whatever smells most like fear. These ones are planning." She felt cold realization wash over her. This is a trap. Even as the words left her mouth, the real attack began. The rogues at the goat pen were the distraction. The real threat came from the woods. A dozen more massive shapes flowing through the darkness like liquid shadow, heading straight for the main compound where the human staff were sheltering. "Shit!" Rowan snarled, and suddenly he was moving, faster than should have been possible in human form, positioning himself between the incoming rogues in the civilian buildings. Briar followed without conscious thought, her body falling into battle rhythms that felt like coming home. This was what she was made for, not standing around processing feelings and examining motivations, but fighting to protect something that mattered. The first rogue reached Rowan just as she arrived to flank it. The creature was massive, easily twice the size of a natural wolf, with jaws that could crush bone and claws designed for rending flesh. It launched itself at Rowan with a kind of savage joy that suggested intelligence beneath the madness. But Rowan was ready for it. He shifted, not completely. She could see him fighting to maintain human form, probably to keep his identity secret. But his strength, speed, and reflexes suddenly became inhuman. And when the rogue's claws raked across his shoulder, the wounds sealed themselves almost instantly. Alpha regeneration, which meant he wasn't just any shifter, he was pack nobility at the very least. She didn't have time to process the implications, because two more rogues were coming at her from opposite directions, and staying human suddenly seemed like a very bad idea. Her shift was different from his, smoother, more complete, as if her wolf form was as natural as breathing. But instead of the liberation she'd once felt, the change brought panic. Her wolf was strong, healthy, perfectly capable of fighting, but it was also trapped, caged by silver-burned neural pathways that made shifting feel like suffocation. She fought anyway. The first rogue went down to her claws across its throat. The second proved more challenging, managing to get its teeth into her shoulder before she could break its neck. But the third, the largest of the pack, with scars that suggested it had once been something other than mindless beast, that one was different. It was watching her, studying her, and when it finally attacked, it fought like a soldier. She barely managed to dodge its initial lunge, rolling away from claws that would have opened her throat. Its follow-up came fast and precise, forcing her back toward the compound wall where her mobility would be limited. This wasn't random animal aggression. This was strategy. "Briar!" Rowan's voice sharp with warning. She spun just in time to see another rogue coming at her from behind, jaws wide and eyes burning with hunger. No time to dodge, no room to maneuver, and her wolf form was still fighting the suffocating panic that came with shifting. Then Rowan was there, in full wolf form this time, and she understood why they called him the alpha of alphas. He was massive, easily the size of the rogues, but with none of their twisted malevolence. His coat was dark gold with silver markings that seemed to catch moonlight, and his eyes blazed with protective fury that made her wolf whimper with recognition. "Mate," her wolf whispered. "Protect, mate." He caught the rogue mid-leap, jaws closing around its throat with the kind of precision that came from years of combat experience. The creature didn't even have time to struggle before its neck snapped with a sound like breaking branches. But the distraction cost him. The scarred rogue, the intelligent one, used the opportunity to launch itself at his exposed flank, silver claws extended to cause maximum damage. Briar moved without thought, putting herself between the rogue and Rowan, accepting the creature's claws across her ribs in exchange for a clear shot at its throat. Her teeth found their mark, but not before the silver-tainted claws opened deep gashes across her side. Silver poisoning hit her system like liquid fire, and her shift destabilized. She found herself caught between forms, part human, part wolf, and wholly vulnerable as the remaining rogues sensed weakness and closed in. That's when Rowan lost control. The sound that came from his throat wasn't a howl. It was something deeper, more primal. The voice of an alpha in full protective fury, commanding absolute obedience from every wolf within miles. Even the rogues, twisted as they were, couldn't entirely ignore the genetic imperative to submit. They hesitated, and in that moment of hesitation, the other rangers arrived. The fight became a rout. Silver nets and crossbow bolts, coordinated pack tactics, and superior numbers. Within minutes, the surviving rogues were dead or fleeing back into the forest, leaving behind a compound that looked like a battlefield. Briar found herself human again, naked and shivering in the cold air, silver burns across her ribs, sending waves of nausea through her system. But alive. They were all alive, even the goats, which struck her as something of a miracle. Strong hands wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, and she looked up to find Rowan, human again, but still radiating the kind of protective authority that made her wolf want to roll over and show her throat. "Easy," he murmured, his voice rough from shifting. "You're safe. It's over. The others? Cuts and bruises, nothing serious. You took the worst of it." His fingers ghosted over the silver burns on her ribs, and she hissed at the contact. "We need to get these cleaned and treated before infection sets in." She wanted to argue, to insist she could handle her own injuries, but the silver poisoning was making it hard to think clearly. Instead, she found herself leaning into his warmth, accepting comfort for the first time in longer than she could remember. "That was well done," Marcus said, approaching with obvious relief. "Both of you, if you hadn't spotted the trap." "Just doing the job," Briar managed. "That wasn't just doing the job. That was—" Marcus paused, studying them both with new understanding. "That was pack behavior. You fought like a mated pair." The words hung in the air, loaded with implications none of them were ready to address. Finally, Rowan stood, helping Briar to her feet with careful gentleness. "Let's get everyone patched up," he said, his voice carrying enough authority to end the conversation. "We'll worry about explanations later." But as they made their way toward the infirmary, Briar caught him looking at her with something that might have been wonder in his golden eyes. And despite the silver burning through her system, despite the exhaustion and confusion, and the 100 reasons this was all impossible, she found herself looking back. Chapter 6. Scent of the Storm. The infirmary was controlled chaos. Rangers with minor wounds waiting their turn, the pack medic, a stern woman named Catherine, moving efficiently between patients, and the sharp smell of antiseptic trying unsuccessfully to mask the lingering scent of blood in battle. Briar found herself on one of the narrow cots, gritting her teeth as Catherine cleaned the silver burns across her ribs. The wounds weren't deep, but silver poisoning made even minor injuries complicated to treat. "Hold still," Catherine muttered, her hands surprisingly gentle despite her brusque manner. "Silver burns need to be completely clean, or they'll fester." "I know." Briar's voice was tight with pain, but she remained motionless as the medic worked. "Do you now?" Catherine's eyes flicked to the older scars on Briar's face and arms. "Personal experience?" "Something like that." From across the room, she could feel Rowan watching her. He'd refused treatment for his own injuries, minor cuts that his alpha healing had already sealed, and positioned himself where he could keep an eye on everyone who'd been hurt in the attack. Protective behavior, the kind that mated alphas showed toward their pack, their territory, their... She cut the thought off before it could fully form. Whatever was happening between them, whatever she'd felt during the fight, it was just adrenaline and proximity, battle bonding. Nothing more significant than shared danger creating artificial intimacy, even if her wolf was currently purring with satisfaction every time his scent drifted her way. "There." Catherine finished bandaging the burns and stepped back. "Keep these dry for the next few days and come see me if you develop fever or unusual discharge. Silver poisoning can be tricky." "Understood." "Thank you." Briar started to stand, intending to return to her temporary quarters and process the night's events in private. But the movement sent a wave of dizziness through her system, and she found herself swaying dangerously. Strong hands steadied her. Rowan, of course, moving with that inhuman speed that suggested his wolf was still very close to the surface. "Easy," he murmured, one arm around her waist to support her weight. "Silver poisoning takes time to work through your system." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." His voice carried a note of authority that made her wolf want to submit. "Catherine, how long before the poisoning clears her system?" 24 to 48 hours, depending on her healing rate. She needs rest, fluids, and someone to monitor her for complications. The medic studied them both with calculating eyes. "I'd normally keep her here for observation, but all my beds are occupied. Do you have somewhere she can recover quietly?" "She's staying with me," Rowan said without hesitation. "I can monitor her condition." "Excellent. Keep her hydrated, watch for fever, and bring her back if the burns show signs of infection." Briar wanted to protest, to insist she could take care of herself, but the words got lost somewhere between her brain and her mouth. The silver poisoning was affecting her coordination, her thinking, even her ability to maintain the careful emotional distance she'd cultivated over the past 3 years, which was why she found herself leaning into Rowan's warmth as he helped her walk back to his quarters, accepting comfort she normally would have rejected. "This is temporary," she mumbled as he guided her through the door. "Of course it is. Just until the poisoning clears." "Absolutely. I don't need a babysitter. Wouldn't dream of it." His agreement was so immediate, so obviously insincere, that despite everything she found herself smiling. "You're humoring me." "I'm agreeing with you." "There's a difference." He settled her in the small sitting area, wrapping her in blankets and pressing a cup of tea into her hands. The brew was bitter but warming, with an undertaste that suggested healing herbs. "Catherine's mixture?" she asked. "Among other things. It'll help with the nausea and disorientation." She sipped the tea gratefully, feeling some of the tension leave her muscles as the warmth spread through her system. Across the room, Rowan was building up the fire, his movements economical and practiced. "Thank you," she said quietly. "For what?" "Tonight, the fight. You didn't have to." She paused, struggling to find words that wouldn't reveal too much. "You could have been killed, putting yourself between those rogues in the compound." He turned to face her, firelight dancing across his features. "So could you. That's different. I'm expendable." The words came out more bitter than she'd intended, carrying 3 years of self-recrimination and carefully cultivated isolation. But they had an unexpected effect. Rowan's expression went completely still, and something dangerous flickered in his golden eyes. "Don't," he said quietly, "ever say that again." "It's true. I'm nobody special. Just another broken soldier with—" "You're not broken." He moved toward her with predatory grace, coming to kneel in front of her chair. "And you're sure as hell not expendable. Not to this pack, not to me." The intensity in his voice made her breath catch. "Rowan, do you know what I saw tonight? When those rogues were closing in on you?" His hands came up to cup her face, thumbs tracing the silver scars with reverent gentleness. "I saw my wolf's other half. I saw the person I'd been searching for my entire life, about to be torn apart by monsters. That's just biology, chemistry, battle bonding." He leaned closer, close enough that she could feel his breath against her lips. "Call it whatever you want, but don't call it meaningless." The air between them felt charged, electric with possibility and desire. She should pull back, should maintain the safe distance that had kept her heart intact for 3 years. But the silver poisoning had lowered her defenses, and the memory of fighting beside him, of moving in perfect synchronization, of trusting him to guard her back, made it impossible to pretend this was just physical attraction. "This is crazy," she whispered. "Probably. We barely know each other. I know you'd die to protect innocent people. I know you fight like a demon and sing like an angel. I know your coffee is strong enough to wake the dead, and you check the locks twice because trust doesn't come easy." His thumbs continued their gentle exploration of her scars. "I know you're beautiful and brave and stubborn as hell, and I've been falling for you since the moment you knocked me on my ass. Rowan." His name came out breathless, desperate. "Tell me you don't feel it," he said softly. "Tell me tonight meant nothing, that fighting beside you didn't feel like coming home, and I'll walk away right now." She couldn't. The words simply wouldn't come, because they would have been lies, and she'd never been good at lying to herself. Instead, she reached up and touched his face, her scarred fingers tracing the strong line of his jaw, just as his were tracing hers. "I feel it," she admitted, "but feeling something and being able to do something about it are two different things." "Why?" The simple question broke her heart. "Because you're not really Rowan Voss, gatekeeper. You're someone important, someone with responsibilities and obligations I can't begin to understand. And you're perfect. I'm damaged goods. So am I." The confession was so quiet she almost missed it, but there was something in his voice, some deep well of pain that suggested his scars weren't all visible. What do you mean? He was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if it might hold answers to questions he was afraid to voice. I told you I wanted what my parents had, he said finally. A mate who chose me for myself, not for what I could give them. But the truth is, I'm not sure there's enough left of myself to be worth choosing. I don't understand. Power changes you, corrupts you, even when you try to resist it. I've made decisions that got good people killed. I've compromised my principles in the name of political necessity. I've become someone my younger self would probably despise. His smile was bitter, self-deprecating. 3 years ago, I walked away from court because I was afraid of what I was becoming. But you can't run from yourself. She studied his face in the firelight, seeing the guilt and self-doubt he tried so hard to hide. It was familiar territory, the constant questioning, the wondering if you were still one of the good guys or if you'd crossed some invisible line without noticing. You want to know what I see when I look at you? She asked. He met her eyes and she saw vulnerability there that made her chest ache. I see a man who spends his nights singing lullabies to pregnant goats. I see someone who knows every ranger's name, who listens to their problems like they matter. I see an alpha who puts his own life on the line to protect his pack, who'd rather give up his crown than marry someone he doesn't love. She leaned closer until their foreheads were almost touching. I see someone worth choosing. The words hung between them, heavy with meaning and possibility. For a heartbeat, neither of them moved. Then Rowan's hand slid into her hair, and he kissed her. It was gentle at first, careful, questioning, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But when she kissed him back, when her hands fisted in his shirt and pulled him closer, gentleness gave way to something deeper. Hunger, recognition, the desperate relief of two lonely people discovering they weren't alone anymore. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, the silver thread she'd glimpsed during their first fight was visible again, a shimmer of gold and silver connecting their hearts, pulsing in time with their racing pulses. Bond, Rowan whispered, staring at the thread with wonder. It's a mating bond. Briar felt panic surge through her system. No, that's not. We can't. Why not? Because mating bonds are permanent. Because they require trust I'm not sure I'm capable of. Because once you really know me, once you understand what I've done, what I've become, you'll... He silenced her with another kiss, this one fierce and claiming. Try me, he said against her lips. And despite every rational objection her mind could produce, she found herself wanting to do exactly that. Outside, the storm that had been building all evening finally broke, rain lashing against the windows with enough force to shake the glass. But inside, wrapped in firelight and possibility, they were safe. For now. Chapter 7. The Noble Ball Ultimatum. Morning came with official complications. Briar woke in the narrow bed of her temporary room, alone but surrounded by the lingering scent of warm mail and something deeper, something that made her wolf purr with satisfaction. Memory returned in fragments. The midnight attack, silver burns across her ribs, and Rowan's hands in her hair as he kissed her like she was something precious. The mating bond. She could still see it if she concentrated, a thread of gold and silver connecting her heart to his, even through the walls that separated them. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely impossible. She was still contemplating the impossibility of it all when voices from the main room interrupted her thoughts. Official voices, speaking in the formal cadences of court business. Direct orders from the Pack Council. The harvest ball is in 10 days, and your presence is required immediately. I understand the timeline, Rowan's voice carefully controlled, but the border situation requires... The border situation is precisely why you're needed at court. These attacks on our supply lines are making the pack look weak, vulnerable. The nobles are questioning your leadership, wondering if perhaps it's time for a change in management. Briar eased out of bed and moved to the door, pressing her ear against the wood. She knew she shouldn't eavesdrop, but the conversation clearly involved more than just social obligations. Let them question. Rowan's tone had gone cold. I've been protecting these borders for 3 years while they sipped wine and played politics. And that protection has apparently failed, hasn't it? The new voice was smooth, cultured, with the kind of casual arrogance that came from inherited power. 2 major convoy attacks in as many days. Raiders operating with inside information. Some are saying that perhaps your unorthodox living arrangements have compromised your effectiveness. A pause, then, "What are you implying, counselor?" "I'm not implying anything. I'm stating facts. You've been living like a commoner, surrounded by mercenaries and outcasts, completely cut off from pack politics and noble society. Is it any wonder that security has become compromised?" Another pause, longer this time. When Rowan spoke again, his voice carried a dangerous edge. "Careful, Marcus." That almost sounded like an accusation. Not an accusation, an observation. "These attacks didn't begin until you hired that ranger. The one with the interesting history." Briar's blood ran cold. They were talking about her. Briar Nighthelm is a decorated veteran with an exemplary service record. Briar Nighthelm is a war criminal who sold out her entire legion to save her own skin. The words hit like physical blows. War criminal, traitor, the same accusations that had followed her for 3 years, turning her from hero to pariah overnight. "That's not true." Rowan's voice was steel wrapped in silk. "She was investigated and cleared of all charges." "Officially, yes, but we both know how flexible official findings can be when political pressure is applied. The fact remains that she was the sole survivor of a massacre that claimed 800 lives. Either she's extraordinarily lucky or she's extraordinarily treacherous." Briar closed her eyes, fighting the familiar wave of shame and guilt. She'd heard it all before. The whispered accusations, the knowing looks, the assumption that her survival somehow proved her guilt. It didn't matter that she'd been exonerated. It didn't matter that the real traitor had eventually been exposed and executed. In the court of public opinion, she would always be the one who lived when heroes died. "Furthermore," the counselor continued, "her presence here creates complications. The nobles you're expected to court at the Harvest Ball have families, Rowan. Families who lost sons and daughters when the She-Wolf Legion fell. How do you think they'll react to discovering you've been harboring the woman they blame for those deaths?" "They'll react however I tell them to react," Rowan said flatly. "I'm still their alpha." "Are you?" "Because from where the council sits, it looks like you've gone native. Living in squalor, consorting with criminals, ignoring your duties to the pack in favor of playing farmer." The counselor's voice hardened. "Perhaps it's time to consider whether someone else might be better suited to lead." The threat was unmistakable. Briar felt her wolf snarl with protective fury, but she forced herself to remain still. This was pack politics, noble maneuvering, the kind of chess game where people like her were always pawns. "I see," Rowan's voice was deadly calm. "And I suppose the council has someone in mind for my replacement? Your cousin Aldrich has expressed interest in serving the pack's greater good. He's unmarried, well-connected, and importantly, he's never shown any tendency toward romantic entanglements with unsuitable partners." Briar's heart clenched. They knew. Somehow they knew about the bond forming between her and Rowan, and they were using it as a weapon. "Aldrich is welcome to express all the interest he likes," Rowan said, "but the succession laws are clear. I remain alpha until I choose to step down or die in challenge, or until you're declared unfit to rule." The counselor's voice carried smug satisfaction. "Which brings us back to the Harvest Ball. 10 days, Rowan. 10 days to choose a suitable bride and prove to the pack that you're still capable of putting duty before personal desire. Fail to do so, and the council will have no choice but to act in the pack's best interests." Footsteps, the sound of the door opening and closing. Then silence. Briar remained frozen against the door, processing what she'd heard. They were using her as leverage, threatening Rowan's position because of their growing bond. Everything she touched turned to poison. First her legion, now this. She should leave, pack her few belongings, disappear into the forest before dawn, and remove herself as a complication from his life. It would be the honorable thing to do, the smart thing, the cowardly thing. A soft knock on her door interrupted her spiral of self-recrimination. "Briar, are you awake?" She opened the door to find Rowan standing in the hallway, looking like he'd aged years in the space of a single conversation. His golden eyes were haunted, and she could see the weight of impossible choices settling on his shoulders. "I heard," she said simply. He nodded, unsurprised. "Enhanced hearing has its disadvantages. They're right, about me being a complication. They're afraid," he corrected. "There's a difference." "Afraid of what?" "Change. Loss of control. The possibility that their carefully ordered world might not be as stable as they pretend." He stepped into her room, closing the door behind him. "They've been pushing for this marriage alliance for years, using it as a way to consolidate power and influence. My choosing a mate they can't control threatens everything they've worked for. So choose someone they can control." The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she couldn't take them back. He studied her face, and she saw the exact moment he understood what she was really saying. "You want me to walk away? I want you to do what's best for your pack. And you don't think that's you?" It wasn't a question, but she answered anyway. "I know it's not me. I'm exactly what they said. A war criminal with blood on her hands and enemies in high places. I'm the kind of complication that gets good people killed." "Bullshit!" The vehemence in his voice startled her. He moved closer, and she could see gold flecks dancing in his eyes, his wolf responding to her distress. "You want to know what I think is best for my pack? Someone who'll fight for them. Someone who'll put their lives before politics and their welfare before personal advancement. Someone who understands that leadership means service, not privilege." His hands came up to frame her face, thumbs tracing her scars with infinite gentleness. "Someone exactly like you." "I can't shift properly anymore," she blurted out, the confession torn from some deep, protected place. "The silver poisoning, the torture, it broke something. I can change forms, but it feels like drowning, like being buried alive." She waited for his expression to change, for the understanding that she was more damaged than he'd realized. Instead, his touch became even gentler. "Does it hurt?" "Every time. But you still did it last night, still risked the agony to protect the pack. That's different. That was heroic, selfless, exactly the kind of sacrifice a true alpha makes for her people. Her people, as if she belonged here, as if she could ever be more than a temporary complication in his complicated life. "Rowan, be reasonable. Even if I wanted this, even if we both wanted it, it's impossible. Your pack will never accept me. The nobles will revolt. Your cousin will challenge you, and you'll lose everything you've worked for. Maybe, or maybe it's time for the pack to learn that love isn't a luxury leaders can't afford." He leaned his forehead against hers, and she felt the mating bond pulse with warm golden light. "I've spent 3 years running from this choice, Briar. Running from responsibility, from emotion, from anything that felt real. But I can't run from you. You have to try." "No, I don't." His smile was soft, sad, and utterly determined. "I have to try something else entirely." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I'm going to that harvest ball. I'm going to meet with the nobles and the council and all the pretty suitable candidates they've lined up for my consideration." His hands slid into her hair, fingers tangling in the dark strands. "And then I'm going to tell them all exactly why none of them will ever be good enough. That's political suicide." "Maybe. Or maybe it's the first honest thing I've done in years." Before she could argue further, he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promises she was afraid to believe. When they broke apart, she felt dizzy, and not from the lingering effects of silver poisoning. "Come with me," he said quietly. "To the harvest ball? Are you insane?" "Probably. But I can't do this alone. I can't walk into that nest of vipers and pretend to be something I'm not while you're here wondering if I'm going to choose duty over love." His thumbs traced her cheekbones, wiping away tears she didn't realize she'd shed. "I need you there, Briar. Not as my dirty secret or my shameful complication, as my partner, my equal, my choice. They'll destroy us both. They'll try, but they'll have to go through me first." The quiet certainty in his voice made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe impossible things could happen, that maybe broken soldiers could find redemption, and lonely kings could choose love over politics. "I don't have anything to wear to a noble ball," she said, which wasn't agreement but wasn't refusal either. His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. "Leave that to me. I don't know how to dance. I'll teach you. I'll probably insult someone important. I'm counting on it." Despite everything, the political implications, the personal dangers, the certainty that this would end in disaster, she found herself smiling back. "This is a terrible idea. The best ones usually are. We're going to regret this. Probably. But we'll regret it together." And somehow, that made all the difference. Chapter 8. Mask and Moonlight. The capital city of Lunaris was everything Briar remembered and worse. A sprawling metropolis of white stone and soaring spires that spoke of wealth, power, and the kind of casual arrogance that came from never having to worry about survival. The noble quarter was particularly ostentatious, with mansions that could house entire villages and gardens that required armies of servants to maintain. She hated it on sight. "Impressive, isn't it?" Rowan's voice carried a note of irony as their carriage rolled through streets paved with actual marble. "Nothing says we care about our people, like gold-plated fountain fixtures, while the outer districts lack clean water. How long since you've been back?" 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days. Not that I was counting. The bitterness in his voice reminded her that this return was costing him more than just pride. He was walking back into a world that had tried to cage him, surrounded by people who saw him as either a prize to be won or an obstacle to be removed, and she was making it infinitely more complicated. The dress had arrived that morning, delivered by a discreet courier who disappeared before she could ask questions. It was beautiful in a way that made her chest ache. Midnight blue silk that seemed to shimmer with its own light, cut in classical lines that would complement rather than hide her scars. The back was nearly non-existent, displaying the silver marks across her shoulders like badges of honor rather than shame. She'd stared at it for 20 minutes before finally putting it on. "You look—" Rowan trailed off, his golden eyes wide as she descended the inn stairs. "Ridiculous? Magnificent." He moved toward her with predatory grace, resplendent in his own formal attire, black velvet that emphasized his broad shoulders and made his eyes look like molten gold. "Absolutely, utterly magnificent." She felt heat rise in her cheeks. "It's too much. The dress, the carriage, all of it. I don't belong in this world." "Neither do I. That's what makes us perfect for each other." The harvest ball was being held at the Crystal Palace, an architectural marvel that lived up to its name. Every surface seemed to be made of glass and silver, reflecting light and patterns that transformed the building into something from a fairy tale. Carriages lined the circular drive, discharging nobles in silks and jewels who moved with the fluid grace of apex predators dressed in their finest plumage. "Remember," Rowan murmured as they joined the procession toward the main entrance, "tonight is about appearances. Smile, nod, let me handle the politics, and try not to kill anyone unless they really deserve it. Define really deserve it. Imminent threat to life or limb. Everything else we handle with cutting remarks and strategic wine spills." Despite her nerves, she found herself smiling. "You've given this some thought. I've had 3 years to plan exactly what I'd say if I ever came back." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining in a gesture that was both intimate and possessive. "I just never expected to have backup." The ballroom was a study in controlled excess. Crystal chandeliers that cast rainbow patterns across marble floors, massive arrangements of autumn flowers that filled the air with competing fragrances, and enough silk and jewels to fund a small war. The guests moved in carefully choreographed patterns that spoke of decades of social conditioning, each interaction weighted with political significance. Briar felt like a wolf in a henhouse, dangerous, obvious, and deeply unwelcome. "Alpha Rowan!" A woman's voice pitched to carry across the room despite its apparent delicacy. "How wonderful that you've finally returned to us." The speaker was beautiful in the way that only noble breeding and unlimited resources could achieve. Golden hair arranged in perfect curls, blue eyes that sparkled with calculated charm, and a gown that probably cost more than most people earned in a year. She moved toward them with the confidence of someone who'd never doubted her welcome anywhere. "Lady Evangeline." Rowan's voice was politely neutral. "You look lovely, as always." "You flatter me." Her laugh was musical, practiced. "Though I must say, country living seems to agree with you." "You look." Her eyes flicked to Briar with barely concealed disdain. Rustic." "May I present Briar Nighthelm," Rowan said smoothly, his hand tightening on Briar's in warning. "My personal security consultant." "Nighthelm?" Evangeline's perfect composure flickered for just a moment. "Not the same." Briar's voice was calm, steady, but she could see recognition dawning in the other woman's eyes. Recognition and barely concealed horror. "How fascinating." Evangeline recovered quickly, but her smile had developed a sharp edge. "I wouldn't have expected you to be so present. In civilized society, I mean." The insult was delivered with such practiced sweetness that for a moment Briar wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. Then she caught the satisfied gleam in Evangeline's eyes and understood. This was a test, a way of establishing dominance, of putting the interloper in her place. The proper response would be to bow her head, accept the slight, and retreat to the shadows where damaged goods belonged. Instead, she smiled, the kind of smile that had once made enemy generals reconsider their life choices. "Civilized society," she repeated thoughtfully. "How interesting. I've always found that the most civilized people are often the most savage when it comes to protecting what they consider theirs." Evangeline's eyes narrowed. "Are you threatening me?" "Merely observing. After all, I've seen what happens when civilization meets genuine conflict. The results are usually educational." The temperature around them seemed to drop several degrees. Other conversations faltered as people sensed the tension, and Briar became aware of curious eyes turning in their direction. "Ladies," Rowan intervened smoothly, "perhaps we should—" "Oh, I think we understand each other perfectly," Evangeline said, her voice dripping honeyed poison. "Don't we, Miss Nighthelm?" "I believe we do." They stared at each other for a heartbeat longer, two predators sizing up potential threats. Then Evangeline's perfect mask slipped back into place. "Well, this has been delightful, but I really must go find my dear friend Counselor Marcus. I'm sure he'll be fascinated to hear about our conversation." She glided away with practiced grace, leaving behind the lingering scent of expensive perfume and barely contained malice. "That went well," Rowan said dryly. "She's going to cause trouble." "Oh, absolutely, but you handled her perfectly." "I insulted a noble lady at a formal ball." "How is that perfect?" "Because you did it with style and because she started it." His smile was warm, proud. "Besides, if we're going to scandalize the court, we might as well do it properly." The evening continued in a similar vein. Carefully orchestrated encounters with nobles who regarded Briar with everything from curiosity to outright hostility. She met potential brides who simpered and fluttered their eyelashes at Rowan, counselors who spoke in coded language about pack politics and succession laws, and enough duplicitous courtiers to stock a small army. Through it all, Rowan remained by her side, a solid, reassuring presence that made the hostile glances and whispered comments bearable. When conversation grew too political, he deflected with humor. When someone's comments became too pointed, he redirected with the kind of quiet authority that reminded everyone exactly who they were dealing with. But it was during the dancing that everything changed. The orchestra had been playing background music all evening, but as the night progressed, couples began forming on the polished floor. Rowan led her into the first dance, a complex waltz that required coordination and trust in equal measure. "I thought you said you didn't know how to dance," he murmured as they moved through the intricate steps with surprising grace. "I said I didn't know how to dance at noble balls." "There's a difference." He spun her expertly, and she caught a glimpse of the watching crowd, some admiring, some scandalized, all fascinated by the sight of their reclusive alpha dancing with a scarred soldier who should have been invisible. "They're staring," she observed. "Let them stare. You're beautiful, brave, and mine." If they have a problem with any of those facts, they're welcome to discuss it with me privately. The possessive note in his voice made her wolf purr with satisfaction. Whatever else happened tonight, whatever political disasters they might be courting, this felt right. Moving together in perfect synchronization, trusting him to lead while knowing he valued her strength. The song ended, but before they could leave the dance floor, another began. Something slower, more intimate. Other couples joined them, but Briar was barely aware of anyone else. The world had narrowed to just this. Rowan's hands on her waist, his golden eyes holding hers, the steady rhythm of their hearts beating in unison. "This is dangerous," she whispered. "Why?" "Because I could get used to this. The dancing, the dresses, the way you look at me like I'm something precious." She let her forehead rest against his shoulder, breathing in his familiar scent. "Because for a few hours I can almost forget that this is all temporary." "What if it doesn't have to be?" The question made her look up, meeting his gaze with something that might have been hope flickering in her chest. "Rowan, I'm serious. What if we made this work? Not just tonight, not just until the politics catch up with us, but permanently. What if we fought for this? Against your entire pack? Against centuries of tradition and political necessity? Against anyone who tries to keep us apart?" The simple certainty in his voice made her believe, just for a moment, that maybe impossible dreams could come true, that maybe broken things could be made whole, and lonely people could find their perfect match against all odds. Then the music stopped, and reality crashed back in. "Alpha Rowan." The voice cut through the post-dance chatter like a blade through silk. "How good of you to join us tonight." They turned to find a man approaching, tall, elegant, with the kind of classical features that suggested noble breeding and careful genetics. His smile was pleasant, but his eyes held the cold calculation of someone who saw everything as a potential advantage or threat. "Cousin Aldrich," Rowan's voice was carefully neutral. "I wasn't sure you'd be attending. Wouldn't miss it for the world. After all, tonight is rather significant, isn't it? For all of us." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Aldrich's gaze flicked to Briar, taking in her scars, her defensive posture, the way Rowan's hand had moved protectively to her back. "And you must be the famous Briar Nighthelm," Aldrich continued, his tone pleasant and poisonous in equal measure. "Your reputation precedes you." "Does it?" She kept her voice level, professional. "And what does my reputation say?" "That you're a survivor." Rare quality in a soldier. His smile never wavered, but something cruel flickered in his eyes. Of course, survival sometimes comes at a cost. To oneself and to others. The reference to her fallen legion was deliberate, designed to provoke. Briar felt her wolf snarl with barely contained fury, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Survival always comes at a cost," she agreed quietly. "The question is whether you're willing to pay it." Interesting philosophy. I wonder if you've shared it with your employer here. After all, the choices we make in the name of survival can have such far-reaching consequences. "Enough!" Rowan's voice carried a note of authority that made several nearby conversations falter. "If you have something to say, Aldrich, say it plainly. Just making conversation with your companion." Aldrich's smile was all teeth. "Though I do hope you'll save me a dance, Alpha. We have so much to discuss about the future of our pack." He melted back into the crowd before Rowan could respond, leaving them standing in the middle of the dance floor, with dozens of curious eyes watching their every reaction. "Well," Briar said quietly, "I think we can safely say that subtlety is dead. Along with any hope of keeping this simple." Was it ever going to be simple? Rowan looked at her, really looked at her, taking in her defensive posture, the way she was already mentally calculating exit routes and potential threats. His expression softened. "No," he said quietly, "but maybe simple is overrated. Maybe it is." The rest of the evening passed in a blur of increasingly tense encounters. Word of their confrontation with Aldrich had spread through the ballroom like wildfire, and suddenly every interaction carried weight. Every conversation held double meanings. Briar found herself the center of attention in ways that made her skin crawl. Whispered speculation about her past, her relationship with Rowan, and what her presence might mean for pack politics. By the time they escaped back to their inn, she felt like she'd survived a battle. That was exhausting, she said, collapsing into one of the room's chairs without bothering to change out of her formal gown. But successful. How do you figure that? Because now everyone knows exactly where we stand. No more pretending, no more hiding, no more wondering if this is serious. He moved to pour them both drinks from a bottle of wine he'd somehow acquired. Tomorrow, the real fight begins. And you're looking forward to that? Strangely, yes. He handed her a glass, then raised his own in a mock toast. To impossible odds and terrible decisions. To stubborn alphas and the people stupid enough to follow them. They drank, and, for a moment, the weight of what they'd started seemed manageable. Then Briar caught sight of herself in the room's mirror. Elegant in borrowed silk, beautiful in a way she'd never thought possible, but still unmistakably marked by violence and loss. "What happens tomorrow?" she asked quietly. "Tomorrow I formally reject all the marriage candidates the council has lined up. Tomorrow I tell them I've already chosen my mate." He moved to stand behind her chair, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. "Tomorrow we find out if love really can conquer politics. And if it can't, then we'll go down fighting. Despite everything, the dangers they were courting, the enemies they were making, the certainty that this would end in heartbreak or exile or worse, she found herself smiling. "I can live with that," she said. "Good, because I'm not giving you up. Not for the crown, not for the pack, not for anything." His reflection met her eyes in the mirror, golden and determined and absolutely certain. "You're mine, Briar Nighthelm, and I'm yours. Everything else is just details." Outside their window, the capital city glittered with lights and possibility, beautiful and dangerous and full of people who would do anything to keep them apart. But inside their room, wrapped in candlelight and whispered promises, they were safe. For now. Chapter 9. Unmasking the Farmer. The morning of the second day brought assassins. They came with the dawn, moving like shadows through the inn's corridors, while the rest of the capital still slept. Professional killers by the scent of them, silver weapons and carefully controlled emotions, the kind of people who made death look like accident. Briar woke to the whisper of steel being drawn, instincts honed by years of combat dragging her from sleep to full awareness in seconds. Someone was in their room. Multiple someones, moving with the fluid grace of predators who'd done this before. She rolled off the narrow bed, hitting the floor in a crouch as a crossbow bolt buried itself in the pillow where her head had been moments before. Silver-tipped, she noted with detached professionalism, designed to cause maximum damage to shifters. "Rowan!" she called out, even as she lunged for her weapons, but his bed was already empty, and she could hear sounds of struggle from the main sitting area. The first assassin came around the bed with inhuman speed, silver blade gleaming in the pre-dawn light. Human, but enhanced, either magical augmentation or careful drug use that pushed normal reflexes into superhuman territory. Dangerous but not insurmountable. She met his attack with her hunting knife, deflecting the killing stroke and opening his throat in one smooth motion. He dropped without a sound, but two more were already moving to flank her. From the other room came the sound of furniture splintering and something that might have been a roar of pure fury. Rowan's voice, but deeper, more primal. His wolf was fully engaged. The second assassin tried to take her from behind while she was distracted by the sounds of battle. A mistake. She'd been fighting multiple opponents since before she'd reached her majority, and distraction was a luxury she'd never been able to afford. She spun, grabbed his wrist, and used his own momentum to drive her secondary blade up under his ribs. He gasped, eyes going wide with shock, then crumpled as silver steel found his heart. The third assassin was smarter, hanging back and looking for an opening rather than rushing in. Female, Briar noted, with the kind of scars that suggested extensive combat experience. This one would be trouble. "Nothing personal," the woman said, her voice professionally neutral. "Just business." "Whose business? Does it matter? You're dead either way." The attack, when it came, was beautiful in its precision. A feint with the sword, followed by a dagger throw that would have taken out Briar's left eye if she hadn't been expecting misdirection. She rolled aside, came up with her own throwing knife, and sent it spinning toward the assassin's chest. The woman deflected it with casual ease, already moving for a follow-up strike. But the deflection left her slightly off balance, and Briar was there to take advantage. They went down together in a tangle of limbs and steel, rolling across the floor in deadly embrace. The assassin was good, better than good. She fought with the kind of trained efficiency that came from years of professional killing, every movement calculated to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. But Briar had advantages the woman couldn't have anticipated. She'd learned to fight in the crucible of actual war, where hesitation meant death and mercy was a luxury that got good people killed. She'd been tortured by experts, pushed past every physical and psychological limit, and emerged with a kind of feral desperation that civilized fighters couldn't match. Most importantly, she was fighting to protect something that mattered. The assassin's blade opened a line of fire across her ribs, but Briar managed to get her hands around the woman's throat. They locked eyes for a heartbeat, professional recognition passing between them. Then Briar twisted, and the assassin's neck snapped with a sound like breaking kindling. Silence fell, broken only by her own labored breathing and the continued sounds of battle from the main room. She gathered her weapons and moved toward the door, noting that at least one more attacker was unaccounted for. She found the main room in shambles, furniture overturned, walls cracked, and scorch marks that suggested someone had been throwing around serious magic. In the center of the destruction, Rowan was locked in combat with two remaining assassins. But he wasn't entirely human anymore. His shift was partial but dramatic, claws instead of fingernails, fangs that gleam white in the morning light, and eyes that burned like molten gold. His movements had the fluid grace of his wolf form, but the tactical intelligence of his human mind. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely unmistakable. Alpha. Not just any alpha, but one with the kind of power that made lesser wolves drop to their bellies in instinctive submission. One of the assassins, a massive man with arms like tree trunks, was already down, his chest opened by claws that could shred steel. The other was backing toward the window, clearly reconsidering his life choices. "This contract is void," the surviving assassin said, his voice tight with barely controlled fear. "Nobody said anything about fighting the Wolf King." Wolf King. The title hit Briar like a physical blow, confirming what she'd already begun to suspect. Rowan wasn't just pack nobility or even a regional alpha. He was the Wolf King, the most powerful shifter in the known world, the one who could command the loyalty of every pack from the ice lands to the southern deserts. No wonder the council was so desperate to control his marriage choices. "Smart man," Rowan said, his voice carrying harmonics that made her wolf want to roll over and expose her throat. "Now tell me who sent you." "Can't. Client confidentiality and professional ethics." "I can respect that." Rowan moved closer, and the assassin pressed back against the window. "But I'm afraid your professional ethics are about to conflict with my personal survival instincts." The assassin took one look at Rowan's extended claws, apparently decided that discretion was the better part of valor, and threw himself through the window in a shower of glass and splintered wood. "Should we go after him?" Briar asked. "Let him run. He'll report back to whoever hired him, and they'll know that killing us won't be as simple as they hoped." Rowan's partial shift began to recede, claws retracting and fangs returning to normal human proportions. "Besides, we have bigger problems." As if summoned by his words, the sound of running feet echoed in the hallway outside their room. Multiple sets moving with military precision. But these weren't more assassins. The footsteps were too regular, too coordinated. City Guard, responding to reports of violence and property damage. "We need to go," Briar said, already moving toward their scattered belongings. "Agreed. But where?" "They'll have the exits watched within minutes. Leave that to me." She'd spent 3 years living rough, staying ahead of people who wanted her dead or captured. She knew how to disappear in crowded cities, how to move without being seen, how to find bolt holes in safe houses in even the most civilized places. What she hadn't counted on was the crowd that had gathered outside the inn. Word of the morning's violence had spread through the surrounding neighborhood like wildfire, drawing curious onlookers, street vendors hoping to capitalize on the excitement, and enough general chaos to make their escape significantly more complicated. But it was the composition of the crowd that made her blood run cold. Nobles. Dozens of them, all dressed in their mourning finery, all watching the inn's exits with the focused attention of hunters waiting for prey to emerge. They'd been expecting this, the attack, the chaos, the opportunity to catch Rowan at his most vulnerable. Trap, she breathed, recognizing the setup with the instincts of someone who'd walked into her share of ambushes. I know. Rowan's voice was grim. The question is whether they want us dead or just publicly humiliated. The answer came in the form of Counselor Marcus pushing through the crowd, accompanied by what looked like half the pack's noble families. His expression was a careful mixture of concern and barely concealed satisfaction. Alpha Rowan, he called out, his voice pitched to carry across the square. Thank the ancestors you're safe. When we heard about the attack, the crowd's reaction was immediate and dramatic. Gasps of wonder, whispered prayers, and the kind of awed silence that greeted genuine miracles. Even the most cynical nobles couldn't argue with what they were seeing. A mating bond in its full glory was unmistakable, impossible to fake or manufacture. Aldrich's face went pale, his carefully constructed challenge crumbling in the face of undeniable evidence. Impossible, he breathed. She's nobody. How could she be mated to a king? Briar's voice was soft but carried clearly across the square. Maybe because he's not just a king. Maybe because underneath all the politics and expectations and royal responsibility, he's a man who tends injured animals and believes in doing what's right even when it's difficult. She turned back to the crowd, still maintaining the visible bond between them. You want to know about my past? About the accusations and the shame, and the reasons you think I'm unworthy? Her voice gained strength, carrying the kind of conviction that came from absolute certainty. I was a soldier who lost her entire command to betrayal. I survived when heroes died, and I've spent 3 years wondering if that made me a coward or just unlucky. I have scars from silver chains and nightmares from torture chambers, and I can't shift properly anymore without feeling like I'm drowning. The admissions were painful, but she forced herself to continue. But I also know what it means to fight for something bigger than yourself. I know what it means to stand between innocent people and those who would hurt them. And I know that love isn't about being worthy. It's about being willing to become worthy every single day for the person who matters most. The square had gone completely silent, every person hanging on her words. So yes, the timing is convenient. Yes, I'm nobody special with more problems than solutions. But I love him. Not his crown, not his power, not what he can give me. I love the man who sings lullabies to pregnant goats and stays awake all night when someone under his protection might be in danger. She looked directly at Aldrich. And if that threatens your political ambitions, then I suggest you find a new line of work. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. Then from somewhere in the crowd came the sound of slow applause. It was taken up by others, growing into something that shook the very stones of the square. Not everyone was applauding. Marcus looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant, and several nobles wore expressions of barely controlled fury. But enough people were showing approval that the political landscape had shifted dramatically. Well, Rowan said quietly, his voice warm with pride and something deeper. I think that settles the question of authenticity. Does it? Aldrich's voice was tight with frustration. A pretty speech and a convenient light show don't change the fundamental facts. She's still a liability, still a security risk, still completely unsuitable for... He never finished the sentence. The crossbow bolt came from the rooftop across the square, a professional shot aimed directly at Rowan's heart. It would have been fatal if it had found its mark, but Briar was already moving, her enhanced reflexes allowing her to track the projectile's path and throw herself into its trajectory. The bolt took her in the shoulder instead of finding its intended target, silver-tipped pain exploding through her system as she crashed into Rowan and sent them both sprawling. Assassin! Someone screamed, and the square erupted into chaos. But even as people ran and guards shouted orders, and the scent of panic filled the air, Briar found herself smiling. Because the attack had just proved everything she'd been trying to say about loyalty, about sacrifice, about the difference between political convenience and genuine love. And as Rowan's hands pressed against her wound, his eyes blazing with protective fury, she knew that whatever happened next, they'd face it together. Chapter 10. The Rejection Decree. The aftermath of the assassination attempt was controlled chaos. City guards swarming the rooftops, nobles demanding answers, and Briar bleeding silver-tainted blood onto the marble stones of the square while refusing all attempts to move her to safety. "I'm fine," she insisted through gritted teeth as Rowan tried to examine her shoulder. "It's just a flesh wound." "It's a silver-tipped bolt embedded 2 inches from your heart," he replied, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. "You are many things, but fine is not one of them." The crossbow bolt had indeed missed anything vital, but silver poisoning was already setting in, making her dizzy and nauseous. Still, she remained conscious and alert enough to notice the political undercurrents swirling around their dramatic tableau. Marcus was orchestrating the response with suspicious efficiency, directing guards and managing crowd control like someone who'd been prepared for exactly this scenario. Several nobles were making pointed observations about the dangers of controversial choices, while others whispered about the remarkable coincidence of 2 assassination attempts in 2 days. But it was Aldrich's reaction that caught her attention. He looked genuinely shocked, not the calculated surprise of someone whose plan had gone slightly awry, but the blank incomprehension of someone who'd been completely blindsided. Either he was an exceptional actor, or he hadn't known about the attack. "Curious," she murmured, just loud enough for Rowan to hear. "What's curious?" "Your cousin. Look at his face. That's not the expression of someone whose assassination attempt just failed." Rowan glanced over, his golden eyes taking in Aldrich's obvious confusion. "You're right. Which means either he's innocent of this particular attempt, or someone else is playing a deeper game than we realized." Before either of them could pursue the thought further, Marcus approached with a small army of pack officials, healers, and what looked like half the royal council. "Alpha," he said, his voice heavy with concern that might even have been genuine. "We need to get you both to safety immediately. The palace has secure medical facilities and—" "No!" Rowan's voice carried absolute finality. "We're not going anywhere that puts us deeper into the web of pack politics. Briar needs medical attention, but she'll receive it somewhere I can control the security situation. But the protocol for protecting the Alpha, the protocol has clearly failed, since someone just tried to kill me in broad daylight, surrounded by witnesses." Rowan stood, helping Briar to her feet with careful gentleness. "From now on, I handle my own security." It was a direct rejection of council authority, delivered in front of dozens of witnesses who would carry the story to every corner of pack society. The political implications were staggering, but Marcus was smart enough not to push the issue in such a public venue. "As you wish, Alpha. But surely you understand that the council must convene an emergency session to address these security concerns. The attacks, the timing, the potential threats to pack stability. Convene whatever sessions you like, but do it without me." Rowan's arm tightened around Briar's waist, supporting her weight as silver poisoning made her legs unsteady. "I'll be too busy ensuring my mate's recovery to participate in political theater." The dismissal was cutting and absolute. Marcus's carefully controlled expression flickered with something that might have been rage before reasserting itself. "Of course, Alpha. Your mate's health is certainly the priority, but I do hope you'll reconsider once the immediate crisis has passed. There are decisions that require your input, time-sensitive matters that can't be delayed indefinitely." The threat was subtle but clear. "Handle this our way, or we'll handle it without you." Rowan's smile was all teeth. "I'm sure there are, but as I've recently discovered, some decisions are too important to be left to committees." They left the square in a commandeered carriage, surrounded by a small army of guards whose loyalty Rowan had apparently secured through means Briar was too dizzy to question. The ride back to their inn was tense and silent, filled with the weight of bridges burned and lines crossed. "Well," she said as they reached the relative safety of their rooms, "that was subtle. Subtlety is overrated." Rowan was already laying out medical supplies with the efficiency of someone who'd dealt with battlefield injuries before. Besides, they forced the issue. 2 assassination attempts in 2 days isn't coincidence. It's strategy. Whose strategy? That's what we're going to find out. He began cleaning the wound around the crossbow bolt with careful precision. This is going to hurt. Everything hurts. Just get it done. The bolt extraction was as unpleasant as promised, but the silver poisoning made the whole experience feel distant and unreal. By the time Rowan had cleaned and bandaged the wound, she was fighting to stay conscious. Sleep, he commanded gently. I'll keep watch. Can't sleep. Too much to think about. Too many enemies to worry about. Then think and worry from a horizontal position. You're no good to anyone if you collapse from blood loss and silver poisoning. She wanted to argue, but the combination of injury and exhaustion was making coherent thought difficult. Instead, she found herself drifting in and out of consciousness while Rowan sat vigilant beside the bed. But even half-conscious, she could hear the visitors who came calling throughout the day. First was Elena, the female ranger from Thornwick Gate, bringing news that made Rowan's voice go cold with fury. The compound was attacked 3 hours after you left for the capital. Professional job. They knew exactly where to hit to cause maximum damage without killing anyone. Burned out the grain stores, scattered the livestock, and left a message nailed to the main gate. What kind of message? The king's whore will burn with everything she touches. Charming people, whoever they are. Briar felt, rather than saw, Rowan's reaction, the sudden tension in his body, the way his scent shifted to something dangerous and predatory. How bad is the damage? Repairable but expensive. We'll need new grain stores, replacement livestock, and probably additional security. The locals are spooked. Half of them are talking about pulling their support. Tell them their support is noted and appreciated, but not required. We'll rebuild without depending on people who abandon ship at the first sign of trouble. The conversation continued, but Briar drifted back into unconsciousness before she could hear the details. The second visitor was Catherine, the pack medic, who arrived with additional medical supplies and a grim expression. Silver poisoning is responding well to treatment, but she's going to need rest and careful monitoring for the next few days. More importantly, you both need to understand that these attacks are escalating. Professional assassins, coordinated timing, inside information, someone is playing for keeps. Any idea who? Someone with resources, connections, and a very good reason to want you destabilized. The question is whether they want you dead or just discredited. Does it matter? It might. Dead martyrs inspire followers. Discredited kings just fade away. The third visitor was Marcus himself, arriving near sunset with what appeared to be the entire pack council in tow. Alpha, he said, his voice carrying formal authority. We need to speak, privately. My mate stays. Rowan's voice brooked no argument. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of her. I'm afraid that's not possible. This concerns pack security, classified information, and then you can leave. Because I'm not having any more conversations without her present. She's proven her loyalty more effectively than half the people in this room. A long pause. Then Marcus nodded with obvious reluctance. Very well, but what we're about to discuss cannot leave this room. Understood. Marcus moved to the center of the room, his expression grave. The council has been in emergency session since this morning's attack. We've received intelligence that suggests the situation is far more serious than initially believed. What kind of intelligence? The kind that suggests these attacks aren't random harassment. They're the opening moves in a larger campaign. Someone is systematically targeting pack infrastructure, pack leadership, and pack morale. And they're doing it with inside information that could only come from the highest levels of government. Rowan's expression went very still. Are you suggesting... I'm suggesting that we have a traitor in the pack hierarchy. Someone with access to security protocols, supply schedules, and royal itineraries. Someone who's been feeding information to our enemies while maintaining a facade of loyalty. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Briar forced herself fully awake, ignoring the lingering effects of silver poisoning. This conversation was too important to miss. Any suspects? Rowan asked quietly. Several. But the evidence points in a very specific direction. Marcus's gaze flicked to Briar, and she felt her blood turn to ice. Someone who arrived just as the attacks began. Someone with military training and access to our security arrangements. Someone with every reason to want revenge against Pack Society. The implication was clear and devastating. They were accusing her of being the traitor, of using her position with Rowan to gather intelligence for their enemies. "That's ridiculous," Rowan said, his voice carrying dangerous quiet. "Briar has saved my life twice in the past 3 days. She took a crossbow bolt intended for me not 6 hours ago, which could easily be theater, designed to deflect suspicion. After all, what better way to maintain cover than to stage a few dramatic rescues? You're suggesting she shot herself with a silver-tipped crossbow bolt for the sake of maintaining a deception? I'm suggesting that people have done stranger things in service of revenge, and we all know how much she has to be vengeful about." Marcus moved closer, his expression sympathetic but implacable. "Think about it logically, Alpha. The attacks began shortly after she arrived at Thornwick Gate. They escalated after you brought her to the capital. And now, just as she's gained your complete trust and access to the highest levels of Pack security, our enemies seem to know our every move before we make them." The logic was damning, and Briar could see doubt beginning to creep into the expressions of the council members. Even Rowan looked like he was considering the possibility, which hurt more than any physical wound. "It's not true," she said quietly, forcing herself to sit up despite the pain in her shoulder. "I'm not your traitor." "Of course you'd say that," Counselor Adelaide observed. "The question is whether we can afford to take that chance. Too much is at stake: Pack security, Alpha succession, the stability of our entire society." "What are you proposing?" Rowan asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. "Protective custody," Marcus said smoothly, "for everyone's safety, including hers. Somewhere secure, where she can be properly monitored while we investigate these allegations." "You mean imprisonment?" "I mean protection, from those who might seek to harm her, and from the temptation to make choices that could endanger the Pack." It was beautifully done, reasonable, logical, and completely impossible to argue against without seeming reckless or compromised. They were forcing Rowan to choose between her and his responsibilities to the Pack, knowing that honor and duty would eventually win out over personal feelings. But they'd underestimated her. "No," she said simply. Marcus turned to her with raised eyebrows. "I'm sorry. I said no. No protective custody, no imprisonment, no hiding while you use me as a scapegoat for your own failures." She swung her legs over the side of the bed, ignoring the wave of dizziness that followed. "If you want to accuse me of treason, do it properly, with evidence, witnesses, and a fair hearing. Miss Nighthelm, surely you understand." "I understand that you're terrified. Someone is making you look weak and ineffective, and you need a villain to blame before the Pack starts questioning your competence." She stood slowly, using the bedpost for support. "But I'm not going to be your convenient scapegoat." "Then what do you propose?" Adelaide asked with obvious skepticism. "I propose we find the real traitor, together, with full transparency and complete cooperation from everyone in this room." Her gaze swept the council, taking in their expressions of surprise and calculation. "After all, if I'm innocent, the truth will exonerate me. And if I'm guilty, the evidence will condemn me. And if you're the traitor, you'll use the investigation to cover your tracks and eliminate any evidence against you," Marcus pointed out. "Then watch me closely. Monitor my every move, track my communications, shadow my activities. But do it openly, as part of a legitimate investigation, not hidden away in some dungeon where inconvenient truths can be buried." It was a bold gambit, calling their bluff by demanding exactly the kind of scrutiny that a guilty person would want to avoid. But it was also dangerous, because if they were right about her being the traitor, she was essentially offering to help them gather evidence for her own conviction. "Interesting," Marcus said thoughtfully. "But cooperation requires trust, and trust is exactly what's in short supply at the moment. Then let me earn it." She looked directly at Rowan, seeing the conflict in his golden eyes. "Give me 3 days. 3 days to prove my innocence by helping you find the real traitor. If I can't do it, I'll submit to whatever custody arrangements you think necessary. And if you can, if I can, then maybe it's time to start questioning why your security is so easily compromised and who benefits most from keeping you focused on the wrong suspects. The room fell silent as everyone processed the implications. Finally, Rowan spoke. 3 days, he said quietly, but with conditions. Name them. Full disclosure, no secrets, no hidden agendas, no attempts to manipulate the investigation. You work with us, not around us. Agreed. Complete transparency. Every conversation, every theory, every piece of evidence gets shared with the entire council. Agreed. And if at any point the evidence suggests you're involved, you surrender yourself immediately. No running, no fighting, no attempts to escape justice. She met his eyes, seeing the pain this was causing him. Agreed. Marcus looked like he'd bitten into something sour, but he nodded. Very well, 3 days. But understand, if you're playing some deeper game, if this is all an elaborate deception, the consequences will be severe. Not just for you, but for anyone who's been protecting you. The threat to Rowan was implicit but clear. Fail to prove her innocence, and he'd be painted as either a fool or a co-conspirator. Understood, she said simply. As the council filed out, leaving her alone with Rowan, she wondered if she'd just made the biggest mistake of her life. 3 days to solve a mystery that had stumped pack security. 3 days to find a traitor who might be anyone, anywhere, with access to information she couldn't even imagine. 3 days to save not just her own life, but the future of the man she loved. This is insane, Rowan said quietly once they were alone. Probably, but it's better than the alternative. Which was watching them slowly poison your mind against me while the real traitor continues to tear your pack apart. She moved to the window, looking out at the capital city spread below them. Besides, I have advantages they don't know about. Such as, I know what it's like to be betrayed by people you trust. I know how traitors think, how they operate, how they justify their actions to themselves. She turned back to face him, seeing the doubt still lingering in his expression. And I know that somewhere in this city is someone who thinks they're cleverer than everyone else, who's been playing a long game while keeping their hands clean. And you think you can find them? I think I have to, because the alternative is losing everything that matters. Outside their window, the capital city glittered with lights and secrets. Somewhere among those lights was the person who'd been systematically destroying their happiness, turning love into liability and trust into weakness. But whoever they were, whatever their motives, they'd made one crucial mistake. They'd underestimated what a broken soldier was willing to do to protect the people she loved. Chapter 11. Traitors Reveal. Dawn brought revelations and betrayals in equal measure. Briar had spent the night studying intelligence reports, security logs, and personnel files. Every piece of information the council had grudgingly provided about the attacks. The silver poisoning had mostly cleared her system, leaving her sharp and focused in the way that only came from having a clear enemy to fight. The pattern was there, hidden in the details that everyone else had missed. It's not about access, she said, spreading documents across the small table while Rowan watched from the doorway. Everyone's been focusing on who had information about supply schedules and security protocols. But that's not the real question. What is the real question? Who benefits from the specific targets that were chosen? She pointed to a map of the Northern Territories, marked with red pins indicating attack sites. Look at this. They hit grain convoys, not weapon shipments. Livestock raids, not strategic supply caches. They're creating shortage and inconvenience, not crippling military damage. Rowan moved closer, studying the pattern with the tactical awareness that came from years of leadership. You're right. If the goal was to seriously damage pack infrastructure, they'd be hitting different targets entirely. Exactly. But if the goal was to create the appearance of vulnerability, to make you look weak and unprepared, then these attacks are perfectly designed. She pulled out another set of documents, personnel records and promotion schedules. And that's not the only pattern. She showed him the timing correlations she'd discovered, the way certain attacks had coincided with council meetings and political pressure points. Someone had been orchestrating events to maximize their political impact, using violence as a tool to shape public opinion. This isn't random harassment or even strategic warfare, she concluded. This is a political campaign. Someone's been using these attacks to undermine your authority and justify the marriage ultimatum. But who? Everyone on this list has been vetted, investigated, cleared by security. Everyone except the person who's been running the investigations. The words hung in the air like an accusation too terrible to voice. Rowan went very still, his golden eyes reflecting understanding and betrayal in equal measure. Marcus, he breathed. Think about it logically. He's had access to every security briefing, every supply schedule, every piece of intelligence about our movements. He's been the one coordinating the response to attacks, which means he knew exactly when and where they would happen. And he's been the most vocal advocate for forcing you into an arranged marriage. But why? What does he gain from— Rowan stopped, his expression changing as the pieces fell into place. Aldrich, your cousin, who happens to be Marcus's nephew through his sister's marriage. The same cousin who stands to inherit if you're declared unfit or choose exile over an unwanted marriage. It was a conspiracy that stretched back years, carefully orchestrated to create the appearance of pack instability while positioning Aldrich as the natural successor. Marcus had been playing a long game, using his position as counselor to manipulate events while maintaining perfect deniability. I need proof, Rowan said quietly. Suspicions and circumstantial evidence won't be enough to convince the council. Then we get proof. Getting proof turned out to be both easier and more dangerous than either of them had anticipated. The key came from an unexpected source. Elena, the ranger from Thornwick Gate, who arrived mid-morning with information that changed everything. I've been tracking the raiders who hit our compound, she reported, her expression grim. Professional trackers, but they made one mistake. They used pack territory to stage their retreat. Meaning? Meaning someone gave them safe passage through areas that should have been heavily patrolled. Someone with the authority to redirect guard assignments and create security gaps. She handed over a set of documents. These are the patrol modifications that were issued the day before the attack, signed and sealed by Counselor Marcus. The evidence was damning. Official orders that had created exactly the security vulnerabilities the raiders needed to escape after their attack. But it was also dangerous, because possessing it made Elena a target for anyone who wanted the conspiracy to remain hidden. Where did you get these? Briar asked. From someone who thought I should know the truth. Someone who's been watching and waiting for the right moment to act. The someone turned out to be Catherine, the pack medic, who'd been quietly documenting irregularities for months while maintaining her cover as a loyal pack servant. I've been tracking medical supply requests, she explained when they met in the discreet back room of an apothecary shop. Certain medications have been disappearing from official inventories, sleeping drafts, paralysis agents, things that could be used to incapacitate targets without leaving obvious traces. Signed out by whom? Marcus. Always with legitimate justifications, emergency medical supplies for border outposts, medications for injured guards, perfectly reasonable requests that no one would question. But when Catherine had investigated further, she discovered that many of the supposed recipients had never received the medications. They were being diverted for other purposes, purposes that became clear when she cross-referenced the disappearances with attack dates. The raiders have been using our own medical supplies to drug guard animals and disable security measures. Someone's been providing them with everything they need to make their jobs easier. The conspiracy was even deeper than Briar had suspected. Not just intelligence sharing, but active material support for attacks against pack interests. Marcus had been systematically undermining pack security while positioning himself as the voice of stability and reason. But proof of the conspiracy wasn't the same as proof of Marcus's involvement. They needed something that connected him directly to the attacks, something that couldn't be explained away as coincidence or administrative error. They got it from Aldrich himself. The younger Alpha had requested a private meeting with Rowan, claiming to have information about the attacks that could only be shared in confidence. It was obviously a trap, but it was also an opportunity, if they handled it carefully. He's going to try to implicate you, Rowan predicted as they prepared for the meeting. Frame this as a lover's conspiracy, suggest that you've been manipulating me for your own purposes. Let him try, but make sure you're recording everything. We're going to need evidence that can't be dismissed or explained away. The meeting was held in a private dining room at one of the capital's most exclusive establishments, neutral ground that suggested civilized discourse rather than accusation or confrontation. Aldrich arrived precisely on time, accompanied by two guards who looked more like bodyguards than ceremonial escorts. "Cousin," he said, embracing Rowan with what appeared to be genuine warmth. "Thank you for agreeing to meet. I know how difficult these past few days have been." "Not as difficult as they could have been," Rowan replied carefully. "I understand you have information about the attacks." "Indeed. Information that I'm afraid will be disturbing." Aldrich's gaze flicked to Briar, taking in her presence with obvious displeasure, "though I had hoped to discuss this privately." "My mate is involved in the investigation. Whatever you have to say can be said in front of her." "Very well." Aldrich settled into his chair, with the air of someone preparing to deliver unwelcome news. "I've been conducting my own investigation into these attacks, using resources and contacts not available to official channels. What I've discovered is troubling." He produced a set of documents, spreading them across the table with dramatic precision. Letters, reports, financial records, all supposedly proving that the attacks had been orchestrated by enemies of the pack working with inside assistance. "The evidence points to a conspiracy," Aldrich continued, his voice heavy with regret. "Someone has been systematically feeding information to our enemies, providing them with everything they need to strike at our most vulnerable points." "Someone like whom?" Briar asked, though she already knew where this was heading. "Someone with access to security protocols and royal schedules. Someone with military training and intimate knowledge of our defensive capabilities." Aldrich's expression was sorrowful, but his eyes held satisfaction. "Someone who arrived at Thornwick Gate just as the attacks began, and who has since gained unprecedented access to the highest levels of pack leadership." He pulled out another document, a financial record that showed payments from foreign accounts to an account supposedly belonging to her. "I'm afraid the evidence is conclusive. The traitor is someone who has been using a romantic relationship to gather intelligence while planning revenge against the pack that destroyed her former command. It was masterfully done. The documents looked authentic, the timeline was convincing, and the motive was believable enough that even people who wanted to trust her might have doubts. But Aldrich had made one crucial mistake. "These are very impressive," Briar said, examining the financial records with professional interest. "Particularly this bank account. May I ask where you obtain these records?" "Through private channels. Banking information is closely guarded, but certain connections can provide access when pack security is at stake." "Of course. And these payments, when were they supposedly made?" "Over the past 6 months, corresponding to the escalation in attack frequency and sophistication." "Interesting timing." She pulled out her own set of documents, the real evidence they'd gathered about Marcus's involvement. "Because according to these official records, I was residing in the Whisperwood territory 6 months ago, living as a ranger without any permanent address or banking relationships. Accounts can be opened remotely. Not these kinds of accounts. International transfers, foreign currency exchanges, the level of financial sophistication shown in these records. They require in-person verification, official documentation, the kind of bureaucratic process that leaves extensive paper trails." She smiled coldly. "The kind of paper trails that would be easy to verify if these accounts actually existed." Aldrich's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "I'm sure there are explanations." "Oh, there are. Starting with the fact that these documents were created recently, using information that could only have come from someone with access to my personal history and current financial status." She leaned forward, her scarred face taking on the expression that had once made enemy generals reconsider their life choices. "Someone who knew me well enough to create convincing forgeries, but not well enough to avoid obvious chronological errors." The trap was springing perfectly. Aldrich had prepared evidence to frame her, but in doing so, he'd revealed information he shouldn't have possessed. Details about her background that weren't in any official files. Financial data that could only have been accessed through pack intelligence resources. "Moreover," Rowan added quietly, "these foreign accounts you claim to have traced, They're registered in countries that have no diplomatic relationships with our pack. Banking information from those jurisdictions isn't available through any official channels, and the private connections who might provide such access are very limited. What are you suggesting? I'm suggesting that whoever created these forgeries had to use pack intelligence resources to make them convincing. Someone with access to foreign banking networks, international communication channels, and the kind of sophisticated financial tools that only council members possess. The color was draining from Aldrich's face as he realized how thoroughly he'd implicated himself. But he made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. This is ridiculous. You're both grasping at straws, trying to deflect attention from obvious guilt with conspiracy theories, and Uncle Marcus certainly taught you well. The words slipped out before Aldrich could stop them, confirming what they'd already suspected about the family connections driving the conspiracy. His expression went blank with horror as he realized what he'd just admitted. I didn't mean. You didn't mean to confirm that Marcus has been coaching you through this entire operation? Briar's voice was deadly calm. You didn't mean to admit that your uncle has been manipulating pack politics to position you as the rightful successor? No, Aldrich stopped, his face cycling through several emotions before settling on resignation. You can't prove anything. Suspicions and implications aren't evidence. You're right, but recordings are. Rowan produced a small crystal device, a scrying recorder that had captured every word of their conversation, including Aldrich's inadvertent admissions and obvious knowledge of information he shouldn't have possessed. This conversation will be reviewed by the full council, Rowan continued, along with the evidence we've gathered about financial irregularities, supply diversions, and security breaches that all point to the same source. My uncle, Marcus, this isn't what he intended. Aldrich's composure was cracking, revealing the young man underneath the political manipulation. He said it would be bloodless, that no one would be seriously hurt, just enough instability to justify change, to convince the pack that new leadership was needed. And the assassination attempts? Those weren't part of the plan. Marcus never authorized direct violence against you. Someone else must have. He stopped, realizing he was confessing to even more than they'd originally suspected. Someone else, like whom? But Aldrich had recovered enough composure to clamp his mouth shut, apparently realizing that further revelations would only deepen his legal troubles. The confrontation was interrupted by the arrival of pack guards, not the ceremonial escorts who'd accompanied Aldrich, but the real security forces who answered directly to the Alpha. They'd been positioned outside as backup, ready to move if the meeting went badly. Take him into custody, Rowan ordered quietly. Charges of conspiracy, treason, and plotting against pack leadership. Full investigation, no preferential treatment. You can't do this, Aldrich protested as the guards moved to restrain him. I'm family, I'm blood. The pack will stand for justice, which is something you should have considered before you decided to play politics with people's lives. As Aldrich was led away, still protesting his treatment and demanding legal representation, Briar felt a mixture of satisfaction and apprehension. They'd exposed part of the conspiracy, but Marcus was still free, still in a position to cause damage, and still dangerous. He'll warn his uncle, she observed. Let him try. Marcus is smart enough to know that his nephew's confession implicates him, but he's also too invested in this conspiracy to simply abandon it now. Rowan's expression was grim. He'll make one final play, something desperate and dangerous, designed to either discredit us completely or eliminate us as threats. Any idea what form that play might take? Unfortunately, yes. Tonight is the formal conclusion of the Harvest Ball season, the grand ceremony where I'm supposed to announce my bride selection. Every noble family in the pack will be in attendance, along with foreign dignitaries and pack leadership. Perfect target for a dramatic revelation. Maximum witnesses, maximum political impact. Exactly. Marcus will use the ceremony to present whatever final evidence he's manufactured, probably with enough spectacle to ensure that his version of events becomes the official record. They had hours before the evening ceremony, but not nearly enough time to build an airtight case against Marcus. The evidence they'd gathered was compelling but circumstantial, enough to raise serious questions, but not enough to guarantee conviction in a political arena where perception often mattered more than facts. "We need to get ahead of this," Briar said, studying the documents spread across the table. "Force Marcus to make his move before he's ready, catch him off balance." "How do you suggest we do that?" "By giving him exactly what he thinks he wants." She looked up, meeting Rowan's golden eyes with something that might have been reckless determination. "We go to the ceremony tonight. We let him spring whatever trap he's prepared, and then we turn it against him. That's incredibly dangerous. If his evidence is convincing enough, if he's prepared properly, then we'll be destroyed publicly and permanently. But if we don't take the risk, if we let him control the narrative, we'll be destroyed anyway, just more slowly and with less dramatic flair." Rowan was quiet for a long moment, weighing risks and possibilities with the kind of careful consideration that came from years of leadership. Then his expression shifted, becoming something fierce and determined. "All right, but if we're going to walk into the lion's den, we're going to be properly prepared." "Meaning?" "Meaning we're going to give them a show they'll never forget." Outside their window, the capital city was preparing for the evening's festivities. Banners being hung, carriages being polished, nobles donning their finest attire for what promised to be a memorable conclusion to the harvest ball season. More memorable than any of them realized. Because tonight, in front of the most powerful people in Pack society, the truth would finally come to light. One way or another, the conspiracy that had poisoned Pack politics would be exposed, regardless of the personal cost. And if they were very lucky, they might even survive the experience. Chapter 12. The Chase and Claim. The grand harvest ceremony was everything Briar had expected and worse. A glittering spectacle of wealth, power, and barely contained political ambition that filled the Crystal Palace's largest ballroom with enough tension to choke on. Every noble family in the Pack was represented, along with foreign dignitaries, military leaders, and enough ceremony to stage a coronation. At the center of it all sat Marcus, presiding over the evening's events with the satisfied air of someone whose long-term plans were finally coming to fruition. "Remember," Rowan murmured as they entered the ballroom, "tonight is about more than just exposing Marcus. It's about demonstrating that the Pack doesn't need his kind of manipulation and control. And if his evidence is more convincing than ours, then we improvise." They made their entrance with deliberate drama. Rowan in formal royal attire that emphasized his status as the Wolf King, and Briar in a gown that was somehow both elegant and militant, cut to display her scars like badges of honor rather than shame. The visible mating bond shimmered between them, impossible to fake or deny, serving as living proof of their genuine connection. The crowd's reaction was immediate and divided. Some nobles watched with obvious admiration for the romantic gesture, while others whispered behind fans about inappropriate choices and political disasters. But everyone was watching, which was exactly what they needed. Marcus rose from his ceremonial chair as they approached, his expression perfectly calibrated to suggest sorrowful duty rather than personal satisfaction. "Alpha Rowan," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the ballroom. "How good of you to join us for this auspicious occasion. I trust you're prepared to fulfill your obligations to the Pack." "I'm prepared to do my duty," Rowan replied carefully, "though I suspect we may have different definitions of what that entails." "Indeed, which is why I'm afraid we must address certain irregularities before tonight's ceremony can proceed." Here it came, the trap they'd been expecting. Marcus moved to the center of the ballroom, positioning himself where every guest could see and hear clearly. "It has come to my attention," he announced, his voice heavy with regret, "that our beloved Alpha has been the victim of a sophisticated deception. Evidence has emerged that suggests his recent romantic attachment may not be what it appears." He gestured, and several guards entered, carrying what appeared to be an arrest warrant and a collection of official documents. "Briar Nighthelm stands accused of conspiracy, treason, and using deception to manipulate Pack leadership for personal gain. The evidence is overwhelming and irrefutable." The ballroom erupted into shocked whispers and exclamations. This was exactly the kind of dramatic revelation that would dominate Pack politics for years to come. The disgraced Alpha's mate revealed as a traitor at the moment of his greatest vulnerability. But Marcus had made the same mistake as his nephew. He'd underestimated his opponents. "These are serious accusations," Rowan said, his voice cutting through the crowd noise. "I assume you have proof?" "Indeed." Marcus produced the same forged documents they'd seen earlier: financial records, communications logs, evidence that would be convincing to anyone who didn't know to look for chronological inconsistencies and impossible logistics. Foreign bank accounts, secret communications with PAC enemies, and a systematic campaign of intelligence gathering that coincides perfectly with the recent attacks on our territory. Marcus's presentation was masterful, designed for maximum impact. "The woman you've trusted with your heart and our PAC's security has been systematically betraying us all." The crowd's reaction was shifting towards shock and anger. Several nobles were making pointed comments about the dangers of trusting outsiders, while others wondered aloud about Rowan's judgment and fitness for leadership. Perfect. Let Marcus dig his own grave with overconfidence. "These documents are certainly impressive," Briar said, stepping forward with the kind of calm authority that came from having nothing left to lose. "May I ask when you obtained them?" "Through proper intelligence channels, as befitting an investigation of this magnitude." "Of course. And the banking records. These show payments dating back 6 months, correct?" "Exactly. Corresponding to the escalation in attacks against PAC interests." "Fascinating. Because 6 months ago, I was living in a tree in Whisperwood territory without any permanent address or financial institutions. But more importantly," she pulled out her own documents, holding them where the crowd could see. "These banking records show wire transfers that use routing codes that didn't exist 6 months ago." The statement hit like a thunderbolt. Marcus's confident expression flickered for just a moment as he realized the trap he'd walked into. "Banking systems are complex." "Indeed they are. So complex that creating convincing forgeries requires extensive knowledge of international finance, diplomatic relationships, and the kind of intelligence resources that only council members possess." She moved closer, her scarred face taking on the expression that had once made enemy generals surrender without a fight. "The kind of resources you used when you created these documents yesterday, that's absurd." "Is it? Because according to the timestamps embedded in these financial records, they were generated using the PAC's own intelligence computer systems. Yesterday, at 2:47 a.m., using access codes that are registered to your personal account." The revelation sent shockwaves through the ballroom. Marcus's carefully constructed case was crumbling in real time, revealing the depth of his manipulation and deception. But he wasn't finished yet. "Even if that were true," he said, his voice taking on a desperate edge, "it doesn't change the fundamental facts. This woman is a security risk, a liability that threatens everything we've worked to build. Her very presence destabilizes PAC leadership and—" He never finished the sentence. The crossbow bolt came from the gallery above, a professional shot aimed directly at Briar's heart. But this time, she was ready for it. Her enhanced reflexes allowed her to track the projectile's path and dodge aside, the bolt passing close enough to slice through her sleeve before embedding itself in the marble floor. The ballroom erupted into chaos, screaming nobles, shouting guards, and the sound of more bolts whistling through the air as multiple assassins revealed themselves in the gallery above. But instead of panic, Briar felt a cold, familiar calm settle over her. This was her element: violence, chaos, life and death decisions made in split seconds. "Professional team," she called to Rowan as she drew her concealed weapons. "At least 6 shooters, coordinated attack pattern." "I see them." His voice carried harmonics that made her wolf whimper with recognition. The Alpha's command voice, compelling absolute obedience from every shifter within hearing. The assassins in the gallery suddenly found themselves fighting the biological imperative to submit, their aim wavering as their wolves responded to the dominant Alpha's authority. It was the opening Briar needed. She moved like liquid death, flowing between panicked nobles and overturned tables toward the gallery stairs. Behind her, she could hear Rowan shouting orders to the PAC guards, coordinating a response that would contain the threat while protecting the civilians. But it was Marcus's reaction that caught her attention. He wasn't panicked or confused like everyone else. He was moving with purpose, heading for a side exit with the kind of purposeful haste that suggested advanced knowledge of the attack. Of course, one final desperate gambit: if he couldn't destroy her reputation, he'd settle for destroying her physically, then blame the attack on foreign enemies or rogue elements. She caught up with him in the corridor outside the ballroom, where he was speaking urgently into a communication crystal. "Abort the secondary phase," he was saying. "The primary assassination failed, and—" He turned to find her standing behind him, bloodied but very much alive, with an expression that promised very unpleasant consequences for his recent choices. "Marcus," she said pleasantly, "I think we need to talk." His hand went to his weapon, but she was faster. Her knife was at his throat before he could clear leather, pressed against skin with just enough pressure to draw a thin line of blood. "I wouldn't," she advised. "You're already in enough trouble without adding resisting arrest to your list of charges." "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Political accusations, circumstantial evidence. It won't hold up in a formal hearing." "You're right. But assault with a deadly weapon, conspiracy to commit murder, and coordinating attacks against pack leadership, those charges will stick." She pressed the knife a little deeper, smiling when he winced. "Especially when we have recordings of you ordering the attack to be aborted." His eyes widened with the realization that his own words had just provided the evidence needed to convict him. "Moreover," she continued conversationally, "attempted assassination during a formal pack ceremony is considered an act of war against pack sovereignty. The penalty for that is death, carried out publicly and immediately." "You wouldn't dare! I'm a counselor, I have rights." "You had rights, right up until you decided to play politics with people's lives." She met his eyes, letting him see exactly how little mercy he could expect. "The question now is whether you want to die as a traitor or merely spend the rest of your life in prison as a conspirator. What do you want? Full confession, names, dates, methods, everything. Your entire network, your foreign contacts, your plans for after Rowan was eliminated?" She smiled coldly. "In exchange, I'll recommend life imprisonment instead of public execution." The negotiation was interrupted by the arrival of pack guards, led by Rowan himself. He looked magnificent, disheveled from battle but victorious, with the kind of dangerous aura that reminded everyone exactly why he was called the Wolf King. "Status report," he ordered. "All assassins neutralized or captured. No civilian casualties. And one conspirator ready to make a full confession." She stepped back from Marcus but kept her weapon ready. He was just about to tell us all about his foreign allies and long-term plans. Marcus looked between them, the scarred soldier who'd outmaneuvered his every scheme, and the alpha whose authority he'd tried to undermine. His shoulders sagged in defeat. "Very well," he said quietly, "but I want immunity for my family. My children had nothing to do with this. They don't deserve to suffer for my choices." "Agreed. Full confession, complete cooperation, and your family keeps their titles and property." Rowan's voice was cold but fair. "But you'll spend the rest of your life thinking about the people who died because of your ambition." The confession that followed was comprehensive and damning. Marcus had been working with foreign interests for over 2 years, feeding them intelligence about pack defenses and political vulnerabilities in exchange for support for Aldrich's eventual succession. The attacks had been designed to create instability, while the marriage ultimatum was meant to force Rowan into a political alliance that would have effectively neutralized his power. But the conspiracy had expanded beyond simple political maneuvering. Foreign governments had been using the intelligence to plan larger operations against pack territory, while Marcus had been systematically weakening pack defenses to make those operations more likely to succeed. "How many people died because of your games?" Briar asked when the confession was complete. Marcus was quiet for a long moment. "I don't know, too many. It was the closest thing to genuine remorse he'd shown, and it was nowhere near enough." As the guards led Marcus away to await formal sentencing, Briar found herself alone with Rowan in the corridor outside the ballroom. Inside, she could hear the sounds of the evening ceremony continuing. Pack leaders addressing the crowd, nobles discussing the night's revelations, and the general buzz of a society trying to process dramatic change. It's over, Rowan said quietly. The conspiracy, yes, but not the consequences. She looked toward the ballroom, where their future was being debated by people who'd never risked anything more dangerous than a bad investment. They'll never fully trust me. Too much suspicion, too much fear about what I represent. Then they'll learn. Because you're not going anywhere. Rowan, no arguments, no noble sacrifices, no walking away for the greater good. He moved closer, his hands coming up to frame her face with infinite gentleness. We've been through fire together, Briar. We've proven that what we have is stronger than politics, stronger than fear, stronger than the worst that people can throw at us. And if the pack demands your abdication, if they decide that choosing me makes you unfit to rule, then they can find a new king. Because I'm not giving you up, not for the crown, not for the pack, not for anything. His smile was fierce, determined. Besides, I think you underestimate how much the pack needs someone like you. A disgraced soldier with trust issues and a talent for violence? A woman who'll fight for what's right, even when it costs her everything. A leader who understands that sometimes the hardest battles are the ones fought with words and politics instead of claws and fangs. His thumbs traced her scars with reverent tenderness. A queen who earned her crown through service instead of birth. The word queen made her breath catch. I never said anything about being queen. I did, tonight in front of the entire pack, when I announced that I'd chosen my mate and my co-ruler. His smile was brilliant, transforming his entire face. Surprise. Despite everything, the political complications, the personal dangers, the certainty that ruling a pack of suspicious nobles would be the hardest thing she'd ever attempted, she found herself smiling back. You're insane. Probably. But I'm insane about you. And as he kissed her, there in the corridor, with the mating bond blazing between them like captured starlight, she decided that maybe insanity was exactly what the pack needed. After all, the best leaders were the ones who were crazy enough to believe that impossible things could happen. And love-conquering politics was definitely impossible, which was exactly why it was going to work. Epilogue, The New Destiny. 1 year later, the morning sun painted the rebuilt Thornwick Gate in shades of gold and possibility, transforming what had once been a simple border outpost into something that resembled hope made manifest. The new compound was larger, more secure, but somehow more welcoming than its predecessor. Designed by people who understood that true strength came from community rather than walls. Briar stood at the edge of the training yard, watching a group of young wolves practice combat forms under Elena's patient instruction. They were outcasts mostly, the kind of shifters who didn't fit neatly into pack society's expectations. Too aggressive, too independent, too damaged by life to thrive in conventional settings. In other words, exactly the kind of people she understood. The morning class is making progress, Rowan observed, joining her at the fence with 2 cups of coffee that smelled like they could wake the dead. Elena's a good teacher. Firm but fair, willing to adapt her methods to different learning styles. She accepted the coffee gratefully, inhaling the rich aroma. More importantly, she doesn't judge them for their histories. Learned from the best. The compliment made her smile despite herself. The past year had been challenging in ways she'd never anticipated. Learning to navigate pack politics, earning the respect of nobles who'd initially seen her as an unwelcome interloper, and most difficultly, learning to see herself as someone worthy of the trust people placed in her. But it had also been rewarding beyond her wildest dreams. The Thornwick Academy, as they'd formally named it, had become something unique in pack society. A place where wolves who didn't fit traditional molds could learn to channel their differences into strengths. Combat training, yes, but also diplomacy, leadership, and the kind of practical skills that prepared them for roles throughout pack territory. Any word from the Northern Territories, where she asked? The latest reports are encouraging. 3 more packs have requested academy graduates for their security forces, and the Ironwood clan wants to discuss establishing a sister facility in their territory. It was better than they dared hope when they'd first proposed the academy concept. What had started as a way to provide purpose for misfits and outcasts was becoming a model for pack development, proof that diversity could be a strength rather than a liability. And the other thing? Rowan's expression shifted to something soft and wondering. Catherine confirmed it this morning. Twins due just after the spring equinox. Briar felt her heart skip a beat, the same mixture of joy and terror that had been her constant companion since they'd first suspected pregnancy. Healthy? Perfectly healthy. Strong heartbeats, normal development, and according to Catherine, already showing signs of being as stubborn as their parents. She laughed, pressing her free hand to her still flat stomach where new life was growing. Poor things. They don't know what they're getting into. They're getting into a family that will love them unconditionally, protect them fiercely, and teach them that their worth isn't determined by what others think of them. His arm came around her shoulders, pulling her close. They're getting the kind of childhood we both wished we'd had. It was true. Between Rowan's isolation as a royal heir and her own difficult upbringing in the mountain territories, neither of them had experienced the kind of uncomplicated love and acceptance they wanted to give their children. But they were learning together how to be partners, how to be leaders, how to build something better than what they'd inherited. Speaking of family, she said, your cousin sent another letter. Aldrich's imprisonment had been commuted to exile after he'd provided extensive cooperation in dismantling what remained of Marcus's conspiracy network. He'd taken his family to the Southern Territories, where he was reportedly working as a livestock manager and discovering that he actually preferred honest work to political scheming. What does he want this time? Permission to attend the twins' naming ceremony. He says he wants to make amends, to prove that family loyalty can overcome political differences. And what do you think? She considered it, weighing forgiveness against caution. I think people can change if they want to badly enough. And I think our children should know their extended family, even the complicated parts. Then we'll invite him. With appropriate security precautions, of course. Of course, even a year later, even with the conspiracy completely dismantled and Marcus serving a life sentence in the Pact's most secure prison, they remained careful about security. Some habits were too valuable to abandon. The morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of a courier bearing the royal seal, official business that couldn't wait for regular channels. Trouble? Briar asked as Rowan read the message. Actually, the opposite. The High Council of the Western Territories wants to offer us a formal alliance, military cooperation, trade agreements, shared security protocols. He looked up with something like amazement. They're asking us to host a diplomatic summit here at the Academy. It was recognition of the highest order, acknowledgement that what they'd built at Thornwick Gate had become significant enough to warrant international attention. More importantly, it was proof that their approach to leadership, based on merit rather than birth, inclusion rather than exclusion, was gaining acceptance throughout the shifter world. When? She asked. 3 months, which gives us time to prepare properly and ensure that everyone understands this is about more than just politics. His smile was warm, proud. It's about demonstrating that strength comes from diversity, that the best leaders are the ones who serve their people rather than expecting to be served. 3 months, time enough to train additional security, prepare facilities for distinguished guests, and most importantly, to showcase the Academy's graduates as proof that their methods produced results. We'll need to expand the main hall, increase security arrangements, and probably establish protocols for dealing with foreign dignitaries who aren't used to our informal approach to ceremony. I'll leave the details to you. You're better at logistics than I am. It was true. Over the past year, she discovered a talent for organization and administration that complemented his natural charisma and political instincts. Together, they made a formidable team, his vision and her execution, his diplomatic skills, and her tactical awareness. They were interrupted by a commotion from the training yard, enthusiastic cheering that suggested something exciting was happening. Looking over, they saw that one of the younger students had successfully completed a particularly challenging obstacle course, earning applause from classmates and instructors alike. The student in question was barely 16, a refugee from a pack that had been destroyed by rogue attacks. She'd arrived 6 months ago traumatized, malnourished, and convinced that she was worthless. Today, she was standing tall, with pride and accomplishment written across her face. Makes it all worthwhile, doesn't it? Rowan observed quietly. Every bruise, every political battle, every sleepless night worrying about funding and logistics. Briar smiled, feeling that familiar warmth in her chest that came from witnessing genuine transformation. Though I have to admit, I never expected to find satisfaction in budget meetings and curriculum development. Leadership takes many forms. Yours just happens to involve more spreadsheets than swordplay. Don't worry, there's still plenty of swordplay. Someone has to keep the advanced combat instructors honest. They stood in comfortable silence for a while, watching their students train and grow and become more than anyone had expected them to be. It was peaceful in a way that Briar had never experienced. The kind of deep contentment that came from knowing you were exactly where you belonged, doing exactly what you were meant to do. Any regrets? Rowan asked suddenly. About what? Any of it. The politics, the complications, the way our lives turned out. If you could go back and choose differently. She considered the question seriously. A year ago, she'd been a broken soldier sleeping in trees and trusting no one. Today, she was co-ruler of one of the most progressive packs in the known world, carrying twins who would grow up in a world where their worth wasn't determined by their bloodline. The only thing I regret, she said finally, is that it took us so long to find each other. Worth the wait, though. Definitely worth the wait. As the morning progressed into afternoon, they returned to their respective duties. Rowan dealing with pack administration and international correspondence. Briar overseeing academy operations and planning for the upcoming diplomatic summit. But as evening approached, they found themselves back where they'd started, at the edge of the training yard, watching their people grow stronger and more confident with each passing day. One more thing, Rowan said as they prepared to head inside for dinner. What's that? He gestured toward the horizon, where the setting sun was painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. Look. She followed his gaze and saw what had caught his attention. A double rainbow arcing across the sky, visible even in the bright evening light. Beautiful, she said. Good omen for twins, according to pack tradition. Is that a real tradition or something you just made up? Does it matter? Our children are going to grow up believing that the world celebrates their existence with natural wonders and magical displays. His smile was soft, full of dreams and possibilities. They're going to grow up believing that anything is possible if you're willing to fight for it. As they walked toward the main hall, toward home, toward family, toward a future that neither of them could have imagined a year ago, Briar felt the twins stir within her, as if they too were reaching toward the promise of tomorrow. Behind them, the academy hummed with life and purpose. Around them, the pack territory stretched in all directions, full of people who'd learned that strength came from unity rather than division. And ahead of them lay the future, uncertain but bright, challenging but full of hope, and absolutely worth every impossible thing they'd overcome to reach it. After all, the best fairy tales were the ones that started with, once upon a time, two broken people found each other, and ended with, and they lived happily, messily, passionately ever after. The king in cowhides had found his queen of scars, and together they were writing a new kind of legend. The end. If you enjoyed this audiobook of Romance and Purpose, press the like button, share, subscribe, and turn the notification bell to get more value from what this channel can give to you, and most of all, enjoy the rest of your day.